Elizabeth Wettlaufer was born Elizabeth Parker on June 10th, 1967, in the small city of Woodstock, Ontario. Woodstock, often called the Friendly City, was known for its quiet neighborhoods, modest churches, and close-knit families. She grew up in a strict Baptist household, where her father's religious views shaped much of her childhood. From a young age, Elizabeth was described as shy and socially awkward, often struggling to fit in with her peers. While her family presented a picture of traditional values and discipline, she carried an inner restlessness that never seemed to leave her. In her early years, Elizabeth pursued education rooted in religion, studying religious instruction, before deciding to switch to nursing. She attended Conestoga College in Kitchener, Ontario, and graduated in 1995 as a registered nurse. At first, her career choice seemed to be a natural fit. Nursing offered her the stability of employment, the respect of the community, and most importantly, direct access to vulnerable patients. To her family and friends, it looked like Elizabeth had chosen a life of service and compassion. But even as her career began, cracks were already showing. She struggled with her mental health for much of her adult life. She was diagnosed with major depressive disorder and borderline personality disorder, conditions that often left her with intense mood swings and feelings of emptiness. Alongside this, she developed addictions to alcohol and prescription medications, problems that would follow her into her career. At different points, she sought help through rehabilitation programs, but she often returned to the same destructive patterns. Her personal life also mirrored this instability. In 2007, her marriage to her husband, Daniel Wettlaufer, ended in divorce. The separation left her increasingly angry and unsettled. Elizabeth herself later admitted that this period of her life was one of deep frustration, where her personal struggles often spilled into her professional world. From the start of her career, Elizabeth had difficulty holding onto jobs. Early employment at hospitals raised concerns about her behavior. She was once dismissed from a hospital for giving the wrong medication and appearing impaired on duty. Despite these serious issues, she was able to secure new positions. At that time, regulations in employer communication often failed to flag poor performance records to future workplaces. This loophole gave her opportunities to continue nursing without her full history being revealed. In June of 2007, Elizabeth began working at Carison Care, a long-term care home in her hometown of Woodstock. Most of her shifts were overnight, and supervision was minimal and staff numbers were lower. On the surface, she appeared to be another ordinary night nurse, a caregiver who quietly moved from room to room checking on patients. Families who placed their loved ones in her care never suspected that anything was wrong. Yet, behind her reserved demeanor, Elizabeth was already beginning to develop what she would later describe as dark urges. At Carison Care, Elizabeth found herself in an environment where her mistakes were overlooked or treated as common workplace errors. Medication mix-ups, careless decisions, and unusual behavior on shift did not trigger the kind of scrutiny they should have. For nearly a decade, these warning signs were not taken seriously, and the system that should have stopped her failed at almost every turn. Part 1 of Elizabeth Wettlaufer's story is not yet about the crimes that made her infamous, but about the hidden instability and personal struggles that set the stage for what was to come. She was not a nurse who snapped overnight. She was a deeply troubled individual whose personal demons, professional misconduct, and repeated red flags were ignored, leaving her in the very position where she would eventually commit some of Canada's most shocking crimes. By the time Elizabeth Wettlaufer settled into her position at Carison Care in Woodstock, Ontario, she had been nursing for more than a decade. Working the quiet overnight shifts, she had easy access to patients who were elderly, vulnerable, and entirely dependent on their caregivers. It was in this environment, between the late 2000s and early 2010s, that her crimes began. Elizabeth later confessed that she felt an overwhelming urge to kill, a compulsion she described as a release of anger and frustration. Unlike many killers, she did not rely on violence or physical confrontation. Instead, she used her position of trust and her access to powerful medications. She administered deliberate overdoses of insulin, a substance readily available in the care home. Because her victims were elderly and often already suffering from serious medical conditions, their sudden decline rarely raised immediate suspicion. Her first known victim was James Silcox, an 84-year-old veteran of the Second World War. He died in August of 2007 after being injected with an unnecessary and lethal dose of insulin. His passing was recorded as a natural death at the time. Elizabeth later admitted to police that his death was her first deliberate killing, and it marked the beginning of a pattern she would follow for nearly a decade. Over the years, Elizabeth struck again and again. At Carissant Care alone, she targeted multiple residents, most of them elderly men and women who were already frail. Some of her victims died quickly after the injection, while others lingered in pain or confusion before passing. The unpredictability of insulin overdoses meant that not every patient she targeted died. Several survived the attempt, though their health was left shaken. This mixture of fatalities and survivors would later complicate the investigation into her actions. Despite the suspicious number of sudden deaths in the facility, Elizabeth remained employed for years. Staff occasionally questioned her behavior, noting her emotional instability, frequent mistakes, and erratic conduct on the job. Yet, instead of triggering a deeper inquiry, these concerns were often brushed aside. The long-term care system struggled with staffing shortages, high turnover, and limited oversight, conditions that allowed her to keep working even as her actions became more dangerous. By 2014, Elizabeth's employment at Carissant Care ended after repeated issues with her performance and medication errors. She was not reported to the College of Nurses of Ontario for misconduct, and as a result, she was able to continue practicing. She later found work at other facilities, including Meadow Park Nursing Home in London, Ontario, and eventually a position providing home care in the community. Each new role gave her fresh access to vulnerable patients. Her methods remained the same. She injected residents with insulin, sometimes watching them decline over hours or days. Other times, she left the facility before the effects became apparent. Elizabeth often told investigators that she believed she was acting on a compulsion, sometimes framing her actions as mercy killings. Though her victims' families rejected that idea completely, none of the residents had consented to or requested such actions. They had simply been placed in her care with the expectation of safety. During these years, Elizabeth kept her actions mostly to herself, though she occasionally dropped cryptic hints. She sometimes told friends or acquaintances that she had done bad things or that she had a dark secret, but few took her words seriously. It would take years before anyone fully understood the weight of her confessions. By the mid-2010s, Elizabeth had already killed multiple people and harmed several others. Yet the system still had not exposed her crimes. Patients continued to trust her, families continued to believe their loved ones were safe, and the institutions that employed her had no idea they were giving a serial killer unrestricted access to the most vulnerable people in their care. By 2016, Elizabeth Wettlaufer's life had begun to unravel. After years of working in long-term care facilities and private homes, her erratic behavior, depression, and struggles with substance use had left her increasingly unstable. She was no longer employed in a steady nursing position, and her personal life was marked by isolation. It was during this period of decline that her need to unburden herself finally overcame her desire to keep her crimes hidden. In September of 2016, Elizabeth voluntarily entered a psychiatric hospital in Toronto. During the therapy sessions, she revealed disturbing details about her past actions. She admitted to staff that she had intentionally killed multiple patients while working as a nurse, using insulin injections to end their lives. Unlike many serial offenders who are discovered through evidence and investigation, Elizabeth exposed herself by making these confessions openly and repeatedly. The hospital staff were alarmed by her statements and contacted the police. On September 16, 2016, Elizabeth gave a written confession to Toronto law enforcement officers. In it, she described in detail how she had injected elderly patients over the years, sometimes with the intent to kill, and other times leaving the outcome to chance. This written statement marked the beginning of one of Canada's largest criminal investigations into healthcare-related deaths. Police quickly realized the magnitude of what she was saying. The victims she named had all been elderly residents who had died while under her care in various facilities across Ontario. Many of those deaths had previously been attributed to natural causes, a conclusion that made sense at the time given the advanced age and fragile health of the patients. But now, with Elizabeth's admission, each case had to be carefully re-examined. Following her confession, investigators began working with the Ontario Provincial Police to collect evidence from the care homes where she had worked. Medical records, staff reports, and death certificates were reviewed. Families of the deceased were contacted and informed of the shocking possibility that their loved ones had not died naturally, but had instead been deliberately harmed by a nurse they trusted. This revelation sent waves of grief and outrage through Ontario communities, especially in Woodstock and London, where many of the deaths had occurred. On October 25th, 2016, Elizabeth Wettlaufer was formally arrested. She was charged with 8 counts of first-degree murder, 4 counts of attempted murder, and 2 counts of aggravated assault. These charges covered a period from 2007 through 2016 across multiple care facilities and patient homes. The news made national and international headlines, with many Canadians struggling to comprehend how a licensed nurse had been able to kill repeatedly without being detected for nearly a decade. What stood out most about the case was that Elizabeth had not been caught through forensic evidence, surveillance, or even staff whistleblowing. Instead, she had come forward on her own, unable to carry the weight of her actions any longer. Her willingness to confess set her apart from many serial offenders, though it did not lessen the horror of her crimes. For the families of the victims, the arrest brought both shock and a painful kind of clarity. For years, they had believed their loved ones had passed away naturally, and now they faced the devastating truth that those deaths had been deliberately caused. As the legal process moved forward, the question of how the healthcare system had failed to detect her actions became a matter of national concern. After her arrest in October of 2016, Elizabeth Wettlaufer was held in custody while investigators built the case against her. The scale of the crimes stunned both the public and the legal system. Never before in Canada had a healthcare worker been charged with such a series of killings across multiple facilities. The Ontario Provincial Police and Crown prosecutors prepared for a complex trial that would involve testimony from medical experts, families, and colleagues. In June of 2017, Elizabeth appeared in a Woodstock courtroom to face the charges. In a surprising move, she chose not to contest the evidence. Instead, she entered a guilty plea to all 8 counts of first-degree murder, as well as to the charges of attempted murder and aggravated assault. By doing so, she avoided a lengthy trial and spared families from the emotional strain of listening to evidence presented in court. During the sentencing hearing, Elizabeth spoke openly about her actions. She admitted to struggling with personal issues for many years, including depression and a deep sense of guilt that eventually led her to confess. While she acknowledged her responsibility, her statements also left many questions unanswered, particularly about why she had been able to continue for nearly a decade without detection. The families of the victims were given the opportunity to read victim impact statements in court. These statements described the heartbreak, confusion, and anger they felt upon learning that their loved ones had been deliberately harmed. For many, The shock was compounded by the fact that they had trusted the healthcare system to provide safety and care. The courtroom was marked by grief, but also by a sense of determination to seek justice for the victims. On June 26, 2017, the judge delivered the sentence. Elizabeth Wettlaufer was given life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 25 years. This meant she would not be eligible for release until the year 2042, when she would be in her late 70s. The sentence reflected the severity of her crimes and ensured that she would spend the rest of her life in custody. The guilty plea and sentencing marked the official conclusion of the criminal case, but it did not end the questions surrounding how she had been able to act undetected for so long. The case sparked widespread discussions across Canada about oversight in healthcare, the use of insulin, and the ability of medical institutions to identify unusual patterns in patient deaths. Elizabeth's sentencing also highlighted the uniqueness of her case. Unlike many convicted killers, she had voluntarily confessed, leading directly to her arrest and conviction. Without her decision to come forward, it is possible her crimes might never have been discovered. For many Canadians, this was both chilling and deeply troubling, as it revealed significant weaknesses in the systems meant to protect vulnerable patients. The conclusion of the trial brought some closure to the families, but it also left them grappling with the lasting impact of betrayal and loss. At the same time, attention began to shift toward how the government and healthcare industry would respond to prevent anything similar from happening again. Following Elizabeth Wettlaufer's guilty plea and life sentence in June of 2017, the focus in Canada turned to how such crimes could have gone undetected for nearly a decade. The Ontario government announced a full public inquiry to examine the systemic failures that allowed her to continue harming patients while working at different care facilities. The inquiry, called the Public Inquiry into the Safety and Security of Residents in the Long-Term Care Home System, was led by Justice Eileen Gilles. Hearings began in June of 2018 and continued into the following year. The proceedings included testimony from administrators, co-workers, families, medical experts, and government officials. The goal was to determine how Elizabeth's actions went unnoticed and what could be done to strengthen protections for vulnerable patients. One of the key findings of the inquiry was that warning signs had been missed. Elizabeth had been disciplined or asked to leave several nursing positions, yet her behavior was never thoroughly investigated. In some cases, suspicions were raised about her conduct, but no clear steps were taken to alert regulators or law enforcement. The inquiry concluded that long-term care homes, oversight bodies, and even the healthcare licensing system lacked the tools and communication channels to detect patterns of abuse. In July of 2019, Justice Gilles released the final report. It contained more than 90 recommendations aimed at improving safety in long-term care. These included strengthening whistleblower protections, improving staff training, and enhancing oversight of medication use, particularly insulin. The report also called for better communication between care facilities and regulatory agencies to ensure concerns about staff members would not be ignored or overlooked. The Wettlaufer case had a profound impact on the public trust. Families across Canada began questioning whether their loved ones were truly safe in nursing homes. The healthcare sector responded by reviewing policies, creating new reporting requirements, and emphasizing transparency. While these measures could not undo the tragedy, they were intended to prevent future harm. For the families of the victims, the inquiry was both painful and necessary. Many expressed that the changes, while welcome, could never replace the lives that were lost. The emotional damage of betrayal by a trusted caregiver continued to weigh heavily on them. Elizabeth Wettlaufer remains in prison, serving a life sentence with no chance of parole for 25 years. She will likely spend the rest of her life in custody, remembered as one of Canada's worst criminals. Her case continues to serve as a reminder of the importance of vigilance, oversight, and accountability in systems that care for the most vulnerable members of society. The story of Elizabeth Wettlaufer is not only one of shocking crimes, but also of the lessons that Canada has had to learn. It exposed weaknesses in healthcare oversight, highlighted the need for reform, and left a permanent mark on the country's collective awareness of patient safety. Though justice was delivered in the courtroom, the true legacy of this case lies in the lasting changes it brought to how Canadians protect those who cannot protect themselves. In the spring of 1977, a quiet patch of farmland outside the small community of Tofield, Alberta, became the center of one of Canada's most baffling mysteries. On April 13th, a couple went to an abandoned property near Lynbrook to remove a septic tank pump, expecting nothing more than a dirty but simple job. Instead, they uncovered a discovery that would puzzle investigators for decades. Hidden inside the tank, beneath layers of debris, was the body of an unidentified man. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police were quickly called to the scene. With limited equipment available, officers had to painstakingly empty the tank by hand using buckets, a grim and exhausting task. What they uncovered was unlike anything most officers had seen before. The remains were wrapped and bound, suggesting someone had gone to deliberate lengths to conceal the victim. It was immediately clear this was no accident. It was a carefully hidden crime. At the time, rural Alberta was sparsely populated, and the location of the septic tank added to the mystery. It was not the kind of place a stranger would stumble upon. Whoever left the man there had to be familiar with the property and confident the site would keep the secret buried. This raised the first big question for investigators. Was the crime tied to someone local? Or had the location been chosen because it was remote and isolated? The RCMP faced another immediate challenge. The victim carried no identification. His clothing, while examined, did not point to a specific missing person. There were no personal belongings to help identify him, and investigators could not even be sure of his background. Without a name, the case already felt impossible. As the investigation began, police gave the man a grim nickname that would linger for decades: Septic Tank Sam. The name would soon spread across Alberta, becoming a symbol of one of the province's darkest unsolved mysteries. For the community around Tofield, the discovery was shocking. Stories of the unknown man spread quickly, and whispers of what had happened traveled far beyond the rural roads where he had been found. Despite the strange circumstances, the discovery did not provide many answers. It raised more questions than it solved. Who was this man? Why had he been targeted? And most importantly, who had gone to such lengths to try to erase him from existence? These questions would hang over the case for years, as investigators faced one of the most puzzling starts to a homicide investigation in Alberta's history. Once the remains were recovered in April of 1977, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police began one of their most difficult investigations. They knew from the start that the man's death was not random. The way he had been hidden suggested planning and determination, and the condition of the body pointed to an effort to keep his identity secret. For investigators, the very first challenge was to determine who he was. The RCMP began by carefully documenting every piece of evidence. The man had been dressed in clothing that included denim jeans, a Levi's shirt, and imitation wallaby shoes. His teeth showed signs of extensive dental work, which investigators thought might be the key to identifying him. At the time, dental records were one of the most reliable tools for identification, and police checked missing persons files across Canada. Unfortunately, no match was found. Adding to the difficulty, the original medical examination mistakenly described the man as Caucasian. This error would follow the case for years, leading investigators down the wrong path and ruling out people who might have otherwise been considered. In reality, the victim was of Indigenous background, but this would not be recognized until much later. That early mistake closed doors before the investigation even had a chance to move forward. The RCMP worked through possible connections to the Tofield area. The property where the body was found had been abandoned, but investigators believed whoever chose it had known the farm well. Rural properties are not easily accessed, and this one was even more secluded. Officers considered whether the person responsible was a local, someone familiar with the farmland, or a person who had visited the area often enough to feel confident it would not be disturbed. With limited leads, investigators turned to the public for help. Sketches and information about the man's clothing were shared in newspapers and on local radio. Tips came in, but none led to a solid identification. For the community, the mystery became unsettling. People in and around Tofield spoke quietly about the case, unsure whether the crime had been committed by a stranger passing through or by someone who lived nearby. By the end of the 1970s, the investigation was at a standstill. Without a name, there was no way to trace the victim's life, his friends, or his family. Investigators were left with evidence that showed cruelty and planning, but no clear suspect. The case file grew thicker with reports, but the most basic detail, who the man was, remained unanswered. It was becoming clear that solving the case would take something far beyond the tools available at that time. As the years passed into the early 1980s, the mystery of the man found near Tofield remained unsolved. Despite limited progress, the RCMP refused to close the file. They knew the case represented more than just a violent crime. It was also about restoring dignity to someone who had been denied even his name. To investigators, solving the mystery meant giving him back an identity. In 1979, a forensic artist created a clay reconstruction of what the victim might have looked like in life. This model was shown to the public in the hope that someone would recognize him. The lifelike reconstruction generated attention, but no confirmed identifications followed. For the community, it served as a stark reminder that this was not just a set of bones, but a person who once lived, laughed, and belonged somewhere. Throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, the case became known among police as the Tofield John Doe. The file remained active, though years often passed without new leads. Technology had not yet advanced to the point where DNA testing could offer answers, and with the mistaken belief that the victim was Caucasian, searches of missing persons records continued to focus on the wrong background. This misstep kept the investigation stalled for decades. Despite the lack of breakthroughs, investigators made sure the case was never forgotten. New officers assigned to the detachment were introduced to the file, keeping the story alive within the RCMP. Forensic techniques were reviewed as science advanced, but each attempt ended with the same frustration. The body's secrets remained locked away. By the 2000 era, hope began to rest more on future technology than on traditional police work. DNA databases were becoming a powerful new tool, and officers began to see the possibility that one day, the unidentified man might finally be named. The RCMP preserved what evidence they could, ensuring that when the science caught up, the case could be reopened with stronger methods. Through all this time, the family of Gordon Sanderson did not yet know that the missing brother and father they grieved for was the same man at the center of Alberta's most baffling cold case. For them, his disappearance was painful silence, and for investigators, his identity was still hidden behind decades of dead ends. It was not until 2020 that the decades-old mystery finally began to unravel. Advances in genetic genealogy had changed the way cold cases could be approached, and the RCMP decided to send the degraded DNA samples from the Tofield case to a private lab in Texas. The lab, specializing in extracting usable profiles from difficult evidence, worked meticulously to reconstruct a complete DNA profile from material that had been considered nearly useless for decades. Once the profile was completed, investigators uploaded it to public genealogy databases. This approach allowed them to trace familial connections, a method that had previously solved several high-profile cold cases in the United States. Within months, the investigation took a major step forward. The DNA matched a living relative, a woman who had submitted her own genetic sample for genealogical purposes, unknowingly connecting her to the long-missing man. After confirming the match with a direct DNA test, the RCMP finally gave the man his name back. 43 years after he was discovered in the septic tank near Tofield, he was identified as Gordon Edwin Sanderson. Born in Manitoba in 1950, he had been 26 years old at the time of his death. Gordon had been living in Edmonton in the mid-1970s and had lost contact with his family years earlier. This identification provided a critical human context to the cold case. What had been a faceless mystery now had a face and a story. Investigators could finally explore his social circle, his last known movements, and the circumstances that led to his death. The renewed investigation shifted from seeking a name to seeking justice, focusing on the possibility that people close to him at the time might have been involved. With the Gordons' identity restored, his family was finally able to grieve with the knowledge of what had happened to their brother and father. They were able to see him as a person, rather than just the victim of a violent crime, understanding that the man called Septic Tank Sam had been a son, a sibling, and a father. The breakthrough also renewed public interest in the case, encouraging witnesses who had remained silent for decades to come forward with potential information. Although the identity of the killer remained unknown, this breakthrough gave investigators the tools and focus needed to pursue leads that had been impossible before. The case was no longer simply an unsolved mystery. It became an active investigation aimed at bringing accountability, even after more than 40 years. With the Gordon Sanderson's identity finally confirmed in January 2021, the focus of the investigation shifted from mystery to accountability. The RCMP now had a name, a life story, and a social circle to examine. Investigators began reconstructing Gordon's final movements, interviewing anyone who had known him in Edmonton and surrounding communities in the mid-1970s. They were looking for patterns, associations, or memories that could point to the person responsible for his death. Although the murder occurred over 40 years ago, investigators believe the killer was likely someone Gordon knew, and the level of planning suggested a personal motive. The brutality of the crime indicated anger or revenge, making it unlikely to have been a random act of violence. Police continue to analyze any new information with modern forensic techniques, hoping that digital records, old police reports, or personal recollections might finally lead to the perpetrator. Gordon's family has now been able to grieve knowing his story, rather than living with the faceless fear associated with Septic Tank Sam. They have advocated for renewed attention to the case, sharing his story publicly to encourage anyone with knowledge from the 1970s to come forward. Each small piece of information could be crucial, especially since many witnesses may now be elderly or have moved away. The RCMP continue to treat the investigation as active, reviewing both old evidence and newly uncovered leads. Public appeals have been issued, asking anyone who interacted with Gordon or knew his associates in the 1970s to contact investigators. Modern technology, such as DNA genealogy and digital record cross-referencing, has provided opportunities that were impossible at the time of the crime. Despite the passage of time, the case remains one of Alberta's most high-profile cold cases. The identification of Gordon Sanderson demonstrates how advances in science can breathe new life into decades-old investigations. However, the search for justice is ongoing, and the killer has yet to be identified. The story of Gordon Sanderson is a reminder of the dedication of investigators and the importance of never giving up on cold cases. It shows how persistence, combined with technology, can finally give victims a name, a story, and a chance for justice. While answers may have taken more than 40 years, the renewed investigation continues, holding hope that the person responsible will one day be held accountable. Cynthia Elizabeth Hack was born on June 12, 1944, in the small town of Oliver, British Columbia, Canada. She was the daughter of Otto and Matilda Hack. Her father was a strict and disciplined English teacher who had also served as a colonel in the Royal Canadian Air Force. Her mother, known to family as Tilly, was a homemaker. Cindy was one of 6 children, with 3 older brothers and 2 younger sisters. Her family was of Russian heritage, and for part of her youth, she lived in Ottawa because of her father's military career. Cindy's upbringing was shaped by her father's firm and traditional parenting style. In her personal diaries, she wrote that her father had been very strict, and that she sometimes feared his disciplinary actions, which included physical punishment. Despite this, she did well in school, and eventually found her passion in the healthcare field. In 1962, Cindy enrolled in nursing school in Vancouver. During this time, her family had moved to France after her father re-enlisted in the military. Cindy visited them during her holidays, and in letters home, she wrote about a man she claimed to be engaged to, an intern she had met while in training. According to her, this man had been diagnosed with terminal cancer and tragically took his own life while the two were on a skiing trip. However, her family never met him, and she never shared his name. In the summer of 1965, Cindy met Roy Makepeace, a psychiatrist from South Africa who was 18 years older than she was. They married in December of the following year. The same year, Cindy graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Nursing. Her family had concerns about the relationship, especially her father, who believed Makepeace had taken advantage of Cindy's trusting nature. Cindy began working as a pediatric nurse at Vancouver General Hospital, where Makepeace had also worked at one point. Though they had professional success, their marriage grew strained over time. Cindy later claimed that the relationship was abusive, while Makepeace denied this, saying he had only ever slapped her twice during their marriage. Despite earning a medical license in South Africa, Makepeace failed to pass licensing exams in Canada and instead took a position at the University of British Columbia. In 1975, Cindy started working at Blenheim House, a care facility for children with behavioral issues. She served as a team coordinator and remained there for over a decade. Her co-workers described her as kind, dedicated, and professional. Although her marriage to Makepeace had ended by this point, the two remained in occasional contact. To others, Cindy appeared to be living a normal, successful life. She had a respected career, maintained close ties with her family, and was known for being responsible and compassionate. But beneath the surface, something was changing. In the early 1980s, a different story began to emerge. One of fear, confusion, and danger. It started with a strange phone call, and from there, Cindy's life would slowly unravel into one of the most baffling and controversial mysteries in Canadian history. In the early months of 1982, Cindy James began experiencing a series of events that would quickly spiral into something far more terrifying. She reported receiving anonymous phone calls, some silent, others filled with whispers, threats, or heavy breathing. These calls often came late at night, leaving her shaken and afraid. At first, she tried to brush them off, believing they might be pranks. But the calls continued, growing in intensity and frequency. Not long after the phone calls began, Cindy started discovering threatening notes around her home. These were often made from magazine clippings or written in crude block letters. One note read, "Soon, Cindy," while others simply said, "Dead meat." She also began finding disturbing items left on her doorstep, including pieces of raw meat and dead cats. Her front porch light was smashed several times, and someone began cutting the phone lines leading into her house. Fearing for her safety, Cindy contacted the Vancouver Police Department and filed her first report. Over the next several years, she would make nearly 100 calls to the police. Officers visited her home repeatedly, and investigators opened files on what they referred to as a stalking case. Cindy said she had no idea who was behind the harassment, but she believed someone was watching her every move. In January of 1983, she was attacked in her home for the first time. She told police that she had gone outside to check her car when someone grabbed her from behind. She said the assailant choked her with a cord and slashed her hand with a knife before fleeing. Cindy was terrified and confused. She was taken to a hospital, and photos were taken of her injuries. The police found no signs of forced entry, and neighbors reported seeing nothing unusual. As the incidents escalated, Cindy began altering her lifestyle. She painted her car a different color and changed her last name from Makepeace to James, hoping it would help her avoid the person tormenting her. She moved homes several times and even hired private investigators. One of them, Ozzy Caban, took her claims seriously and installed surveillance equipment, but no intruder was ever captured on camera. She also began to record every suspicious activity, keeping detailed notes of each event. On multiple occasions, she reported seeing a man lurking around her property. Once, she claimed to have seen someone peering into her windows. Police conducted interviews and staked out her home at times, but there were no arrests and no suspects. By 1984, Cindy's mental health began to deteriorate. Friends and family noticed she was becoming withdrawn, anxious, and sleep-deprived. Some began to wonder if the stress was causing her to imagine the events. Others believed she was genuinely in danger, but that the police weren't taking her seriously enough. Then came another disturbing incident. One evening, Cindy was found semi-conscious in her basement, with a nylon stocking tightly wound around her neck. Her hands and feet were tied. She had no memory of how she got there. A neighbor found her and called emergency services. Once again, the police found no sign of forced entry. Investigators began to question whether Cindy might have staged the attack herself. Despite the growing doubts around her case, Cindy insisted she was not doing these things to herself. She feared she was being watched, followed, and targeted. And in the following years, the violence against her would only intensify, leading to outcomes even more disturbing than before. By the spring of 1985, Cindy James's situation had grown even more disturbing. On multiple occasions, she was discovered in alarming conditions, injured and disoriented, often with no clear memory of how she had ended up that way. One incident took place in a ditch 6 miles from her home, where she was found with her hands and feet bound and a black nylon stocking once again tied around her neck. Her clothes had been ripped, and she had several bruises on her body. Medical staff noted that she appeared sedated, though no drugs were immediately found in her system. Despite these attacks, authorities were increasingly skeptical. Each time Cindy was found bound or hurt, there were no witnesses and no forensic evidence pointing to another person. Many officers within the Vancouver Police Department began to theorize that Cindy was orchestrating the incidents herself, either to seek attention or as a result of psychological trauma. However, not everyone agreed. Her private investigator, Ozzy Caban, believed that the injuries Cindy suffered were too elaborate and dangerous for her to have inflicted on herself without assistance. In one particularly troubling event, in December of 1985, Cindy was found dazed and hypothermic in a ditch with a pair of men's work boots on her feet and a pair of gloves in her hands that did not belong to her. She had been missing for several hours after failing to meet a friend for dinner. A local passerby spotted her and contacted emergency services. Once again, she had no memory of what had happened after leaving her home. In response to the growing fear for her life, Cindy took several protective measures. She adopted a large dog, installed a panic button system in her house, and began carrying pepper spray. She also continued working with private investigators. At one point, her friend and ex-husband, Dr. Roy Makepeace, allowed her to stay at his residence temporarily, hoping she would feel safer. Despite these efforts, the strange incidents persisted. During this time, Cindy also underwent extensive psychological evaluations. She visited several psychiatrists and therapists, some of whom diagnosed her with post-traumatic stress disorder and dissociative symptoms. However, none of them could agree on a definitive diagnosis. Cindy expressed genuine terror during these sessions, and her accounts remained consistent. She often spoke about a mysterious group or individual who she believed was determined to harm or kill her. Law enforcement surveillance was occasionally put in place near her home, but these operations never caught any suspects in the act. Some officers felt this further proved that the events were self-inflicted. Others believed that whoever was responsible may have been carefully watching Cindy and knew when surveillance was in place, choosing to strike only when the coast was clear. Between the years of 1986 and early 1989, Cindy moved multiple times and even changed her phone number several times. Still, the threatening messages and incidents continued. One time, a rock was thrown through her window with a note attached. Another time, she returned home to find her dog beaten and her porch light smashed once again. In several cases, her telephone wires were found deliberately cut, always cleanly severed, suggesting it was not the result of wear or accident. Throughout all of this, her mental and physical health continued to decline. Friends and family were increasingly divided. Some were convinced Cindy was being stalked by someone who had outsmarted the police for years. Others worried that the stress had taken such a toll on her that she may have been unintentionally creating the danger herself. No clear answers were found. But then, in the summer of 1989, Cindy vanished, marking the final and most tragic chapter in her long, strange ordeal. On the evening of Thursday, May 25th, 1989, Cindy James disappeared. Earlier that day, she had stopped by the Richmond General Hospital to pick up her paycheck. Afterward, she went to a local shopping center to run errands. Witnesses later confirmed that she mailed a letter and deposited her check at a nearby bank. She was last seen around 8 o'clock that night. Cindy never made it home. The following day, her car, a beige sedan, was discovered parked in a lot behind an abandoned grocery store. Inside the vehicle were several of her personal belongings, including the groceries she had just purchased, a wrapped gift, and her wallet, which contained a small amount of cash. Blood was found on the driver's side door and on some of the items inside the vehicle. Curiously, the car keys were found beneath the vehicle on the ground. It appeared as though the scene had been staged, but investigators were unable to confirm what had actually occurred. It was not until Friday, June 8th, almost 2 full weeks later, that Cindy's body was discovered. A man walking near an abandoned house in Richmond, not far from where her car had been found, noticed something unusual in the overgrown backyard. Cindy's body was lying in tall grass, partially hidden. Her hands and feet had been bound behind her back with black nylon, and a similar black nylon stocking had been tied tightly around her neck. She was fully clothed. An autopsy confirmed that she had been deceased for a significant period, likely since the day she disappeared. Toxicology results revealed a combination of 3 drugs in her system: morphine, diazepam, and flurazepam. The levels of these drugs were high enough to render her unconscious, or possibly even cause death. However, the exact cause of death was not immediately determined. While the drugs were lethal, the ligature marks on her neck were consistent with strangulation, though they may have occurred after death. The circumstances of Cindy's death created immediate conflict between investigators. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police concluded that Cindy had taken her own life. They believed she had injected herself with a dangerous drug cocktail, tied herself up, and staged her own death in a final elaborate act. However, many medical experts, and nearly all of her family and friends, found this explanation unconvincing. For one, there was serious doubt that Cindy could have physically bound herself in such a complex manner after taking such powerful drugs. The tightness and positioning of the restraints suggested she had little to no mobility at the time they were applied. Several forensic specialists stated that the combination of drugs would have rendered her unconscious within minutes. There was also the issue of the nylon stocking around her neck, something that had been a repeated symbol throughout the years of harassment. Her ex-husband, Dr. Roy Makepeace, publicly disputed the theory that she took her own life. So did her sister Melanie and her parents, Otto and Tilly Hack. They firmly believed Cindy had been murdered and that the police had failed to protect her, despite years of warning signs. Private investigator Ozzy Caban also stated that in his experience, the death had all the signs of foul play, not a result of her taking her own life. A coroner's inquest was held in the spring of 1990. It lasted over 15 days, included testimony from 84 witnesses, and examined nearly 100 exhibits. In the end, The jury was unable to determine how Cindy James had died. They ruled the cause of death as undetermined, meaning it could have been accidental, self-inflicted, or the result of foul play. To this day, the death of Cindy James remains one of Canada's most haunting, unsolved cases. There has never been an arrest. No one has been named as a suspect. And perhaps most frustratingly of all, despite the evidence, warnings, and bizarre pattern of incidents over 7 years, there is still no official answer to the question. Who, if anyone, was trying to kill Cindy James? Or was she struggling with something even more difficult to understand? The case continues to be the subject of books, documentaries, and debates, each offering its own theory. But the truth, like Cindy herself, seems to have vanished in the shadows. On a warm summer night in late August of 1999, Jason MacCullough left a gathering at a friend's house in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. It was a humid evening, and the air was thick with the sounds of the neighborhood. Jason had spent time with friends on Joseph Young Street, but as the night grew later, he decided to head home. He lived with his parents just a short distance away on Russell Street. The fastest way to get there was by cutting through Highfield Park, a well-worn pathway that connected Joseph Young Street to Pinecrest Drive. It was a common route, one that Jason had walked before. The area was surrounded by duplexes, apartment buildings, and basketball courts, and many local residents used the path regularly. But this night would be different. At approximately 1:30 in the morning, on August 28, Jason MacCullough was shot at near point-blank range while walking along the pathway. Residents in nearby homes heard the gunfire, followed by the sound of footsteps quickly scattering into the night. Concerned, someone called the police. An hour later, at 2:30 in the morning, officers arrived at the scene and discovered Jason's body on the path between two apartment buildings at 100 and 104 Pinecrest Drive. He was less than 6 blocks from home. Jason was only 19 years old. By all accounts, he was a kind, quiet young man who had never been involved in any criminal activity. He had no known enemies, no history of violence, and no apparent reason to be targeted. His murder appeared to be entirely senseless. Investigators arrived at the scene and began searching for evidence, but there was little to go on. Jason had not been robbed, and nothing of value had been taken. There were no immediate suspects and no clear motive. The crime had occurred in a residential area where people lived, worked, and went about their daily lives. It seemed likely that someone had seen or heard something. Yet, as the hours passed and the investigation began, one thing became clear. Jason MacCullough's murder would not be an easy case to solve. When police arrived at the scene in the early morning hours of August 28, 1999, they immediately began securing the area and collecting any potential evidence. The pathway where Jason MacCullough was found was surrounded by multi-unit housing, meaning there were numerous people living nearby. Officers went door to door, hoping to find witnesses who had seen or heard something unusual that night. Some residents reported hearing a gunshot, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps moving away from the area. However, no one had seen the shooting take place, and there were no immediate descriptions of a suspect. With no security cameras in the area at the time, police were left without crucial visual evidence. Investigators processed the crime scene carefully. The fact that Jason had not been robbed suggested that the motive was not theft. There were no immediate signs of a struggle, leading police to believe that the attack had been swift and unexpected. The location of the shooting also raised questions. While Highfield Park was a known shortcut, it was also a relatively open space, surrounded by residential buildings. The fact that someone had fired a gun in such a public area meant the killer had either acted impulsively or felt confident that they would not be caught. Over the next several days, police expanded their investigation. They reviewed Jason's background, speaking with his family, friends, and co-workers. Everyone who knew him described him as a responsible and kind young man, with no involvement in criminal activity. He was known for volunteering with local organizations and helping neighbors with everyday tasks. There was nothing in his past that suggested he had been in danger. Despite the efforts of law enforcement, there were no clear leads in the case. Without a motive or a suspect, the investigation faced immediate challenges. Police appealed to the public for information, hoping that someone who had been in the area that night would come forward. However, in the days following the murder, no new witnesses emerged. As time passed, frustration grew within both the police department and the community. Jason's family was left searching for answers, while investigators struggled with the reality that the case was already becoming difficult to solve. With no immediate leads, police turned to forensic analysis in hopes of uncovering evidence that could point them toward Jason MacCullough's killer. Officers examined the crime scene carefully, searching for anything that might have been left behind by the perpetrator. They looked for footprints, fingerprints, or any objects that could be connected to the crime. However, the results of their search were disappointing. There were no obvious signs pointing to a suspect. Detectives also considered the possibility that Jason had been followed that night. They retraced his steps from the party on Joseph Young Street to the pathway where he was killed, trying to determine if anyone could have been watching him. The distance was just over 1 kilometer, a walk Jason had taken before without any issues. Given that the shooting occurred close to apartment buildings, police believed someone in the area may have seen something suspicious. Investigators broadened their efforts by speaking with individuals who had been near Highfield Park that night. They wanted to know if anyone had noticed a person acting strangely before or after the shooting. While some residents recalled hearing footsteps, there were no clear descriptions of a suspect. With limited evidence, police considered whether Jason's murder could have been a case of mistaken identity. This theory was difficult to prove, but investigators could not ignore the fact that he had no known enemies or criminal connections. If Jason had not been the intended target, it was possible that the person responsible had mistaken him for someone else. As weeks passed, the case remained at a standstill. Law enforcement continued to urge the public to come forward with any information, emphasizing that even the smallest detail could be significant. Despite these efforts, no one provided the key piece of evidence needed to move the investigation forward. Months after Jason MacCullough's murder, the investigation remained active, but progress was slow. Detectives reviewed every lead they had gathered, hoping to find a missing connection. The lack of physical evidence made the case difficult, and without witnesses willing to come forward, police were left with few options. In an effort to generate new leads, law enforcement released composite sketches of 5 men seen in the area around the time of the shooting. These individuals were considered persons of interest, though police never identified them as suspects. Investigators hoped that someone in the community would recognize them and provide useful information. Despite these efforts, none of the men in the sketches were officially linked to the crime. A year after the murder, an unexpected development put Jason's case back in the public eye. Authorities arrested a group of men for an unrelated home invasion that had occurred just hours before Jason was killed. This crime took place only a few hundred meters from the pathway where his body was found. During the home invasion, one of the men brandished a firearm, adding to speculation that Jason's murder could have been connected. However, while the individuals involved in the break-in were charged for that crime, none were ever formally accused in Jason's case. Over time, the investigation faced new challenges. Witnesses who may have had crucial information were either unwilling or afraid to speak. Some members of the community believed that people with knowledge of the crime were staying silent out of fear of retaliation. This silence made it nearly impossible for police to confirm theories or rule out suspects. Years later, Jason's case was added to the Rewards for Major Unsolved Crimes program, offering a financial reward for information leading to an arrest. Despite this incentive, no one provided the evidence needed to solve the case. Police have continued to urge anyone with knowledge of what happened that night to come forward, emphasizing that even after decades, it is never too late for justice. As the years passed, Jason MacCullough's murder remained one of Nova Scotia's most haunting cold cases. Despite continued appeals from police and Jason's family, no one had come forward with the crucial information needed to solve the case. Investigators continued to believe that multiple witnesses were present at the time of the shooting, but the silence surrounding the crime remained unbroken. In April of the year 2005, law enforcement announced they were searching for a woman believed to have been in Highfield Park on the night of Jason's murder. They did not disclose what connection she might have had to the case, but it was clear that investigators hoped she could provide new insight. However, there was no public confirmation that she was ever identified or located. In the year 2014, former Detective Tom Martin, who had worked on Jason's case from the very beginning, stated that investigators had come very, very close to laying charges that year. However, without a witness willing to testify or provide direct evidence, the case could not move forward. The challenge of solving Jason's murder mirrored the struggles seen in other unsolved cases, where key individuals remained silent despite knowing what had happened. By the 20th anniversary of Jason's murder in the year 2019, Halifax Regional Police released another public statement urging anyone with information to come forward. They emphasized that even small details could help break the case, and they hoped that the passage of time would encourage witnesses to speak. The case remained open, and police assured the public that they were still committed to finding answers. Jason MacCullough's family never stopped seeking justice. His parents, Carolyn and Alan MacCullough, continued to speak out, reminding the community that their son's life was stolen in an act of senseless violence. They urged anyone with information to imagine how they would feel if they had lost a loved one in such a way. The murder of Jason MacCullough remains a painful mystery. His name is still listed in the Rewards for Major Unsolved Crimes program, and law enforcement maintains that solving the case is possible if the right person comes forward. Until then, his family, friends, and community continue to wait for the justice that has eluded them for so long. In the early months of 1932, the small community of Elma, Manitoba, was covered in deep snow and bitter winds. The Sitar family, Polish immigrants, had settled on a large farm several kilometers outside the town. Martin Sitar, the family patriarch, had arrived in Canada in 1900, determined to build a prosperous life. Over the years, he had developed a successful farm, earning respect from neighbors for his hard work and dedication. Martin lived there with his third wife, Josephine, and their 5 children: Frank, aged 20, Walter, aged 11, Bert, aged 10, Jenny, aged 7, and the youngest, Paul, aged 4. The Sitar household also included Martin's nephew, Tom Hrexkosi, who had moved from Poland about a year and a half earlier to help with the farm work. He lived in the home, worked alongside the family, and participated in daily chores, blending into the rhythm of the household. Life on the farm was challenging and structured by the seasons, yet the Sitars were known as a hard-working and close-knit family, respected in their community and bound together by shared labor and daily routines. The night of January 28, 1932, began like any other frigid winter evening on the Sitar farm. The wind cut through the Manitoba prairie, and the snowdrifts outside made the farmhouse feel isolated from the rest of the world. Inside, the family settled into their nightly routine, tending to chores, preparing for bed, and sharing a final meal before the long night ahead. Martin, Josephine, and the children retired to their rooms, unaware of the horror that would soon descend upon them. Tom Hrexkosi, the nephew who had been living with the family, spent that evening in his quarters in the loft above the main floor. According to later reports from investigators, he was awake long after the family had gone to bed, moving quietly and deliberately. In the early hours of January 29th, he armed himself with an axe and a large knife, tools that were common on the farm, but would be turned toward unimaginable violence. He began his attack while the family slept, targeting each member in turn. The violence was swift and catastrophic, leaving the Sitar family unable to defend themselves. Afterward, Hrexkosi attempted to conceal his crimes by setting the farmhouse on fire. Large pieces of wood were used to barricade the front door from the outside, ensuring that the flames would trap anyone remaining inside and destroy evidence. The once proud Sitar home, a symbol of years of hard work and perseverance, was transformed into a scene of devastation, its roof and walls glowing against the pale winter sky. By dawn, the fire had attracted attention from nearby neighbors, though the full extent of the tragedy was not yet known. The isolation of the property, combined with the harsh winter conditions, delayed any immediate intervention. The scene that awaited anyone who approached would become one of the most shocking in Manitoba's criminal history, and the events of that night would set in motion a desperate search for answers and justice. As the morning of January 29th, 1932, broke over the frozen prairie, neighbors began to notice the smoke rising from the Sitar farmhouse. Martin's brother, John Sitar, who lived on a nearby property, was the first to realize that something was terribly wrong. He and two other neighbors hurried across the snow-covered fields, fear growing with each step as the orange glow of the fire reflected off the surrounding ice. When they reached the house, they found the front door inexplicably barricaded with heavy boards. Panic set in, and they used axes to force the entrance open, revealing the smoldering interior. Inside, the scene was one of chaos and destruction. The fire had taken a heavy toll, but amid the smoke and heat, the neighbors managed to locate 3 survivors: Josephine Sitar, 7-year-old Jenny, and 4-year-old Paul. Josephine was severely injured and died within minutes, despite attempts to provide aid. Jenny held on for about an hour before succumbing to her injuries, leaving little Paul as the sole surviving member. Paul, badly burned and barely conscious, was rushed to St. Boniface Hospital in Winnipeg. The young boy's survival was nothing short of miraculous, given the state in which he had been found. While medical staff worked to stabilize him, investigators began piecing together what had occurred. In his final moments, Paul reportedly whispered 2 chilling words that would change the course of the investigation. Tom did it. These words identified the family's trusted farmhand, Tom Hrexkosi, as the primary suspect. Paul Sitar's whispered accusation became the central clue in a case that would grip Manitoba. His courage and presence of mind in those last moments provided investigators with a crucial lead, turning a tragic fire into a criminal investigation. The community was stunned that a man who had been welcomed into the Sitar home could have committed such a horrifying act, and the hunt for answers began in earnest. With the shocking accusation from 4-year-old Paul Sitar, authorities immediately focused their attention on Tom Hrexkosi, the family's farmhand, and Martin Sitar's nephew. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police quickly organized a massive search effort, enlisting officers from Winnipeg and surrounding towns. The harsh Manitoba winter made the task even more daunting, with sub-zero temperatures, deep snow drifts, and icy winds sweeping across the open prairie. Every hour that passed increased the urgency, as the community feared that Hrexkosi, if armed and desperate, could harm anyone he encountered. The investigation also relied heavily on local knowledge. Neighbors were asked to report any sightings of a man moving through the snow or seeking shelter, and teams combed the forests, fields, and rail lines surrounding Elma. The search stretched over 5 grueling days, with officers and volunteers enduring the freezing elements to ensure that Hrexkosi would not slip through their grasp. Despite the extreme conditions, they systematically covered every likely hiding place, from abandoned farm buildings to thick stands of trees. Finally, on February 2nd, 1932, Hrexkosi was found near a railroad track, about 18 kilometers west of Elma. He was weak, frostbitten, and exhausted from days spent evading capture. When confronted, he offered no resistance and appeared almost lifeless. His flight from justice broken by the relentless winter. His capture brought immediate relief to the terrified community, but it also sparked intense curiosity and fear. People wanted to understand why a trusted family member could commit such an atrocity and how he had managed to remain hidden for so long. Rexcosi was transported back to Elma under heavy guard, and investigators began piecing together the timeline of the massacre. Every detail of the crime, from the planning to the execution, was scrutinized, and the authorities prepared to uncover the motivations behind a crime so shocking it would be remembered for generations. The community braced itself for the answers, though none could have anticipated the bizarre explanations that would soon come to light during the interrogation and trial. After Tom Rexcosi was captured, the focus shifted to understanding why he had committed such a horrific crime. During questioning and psychiatric evaluation, he claimed that he had been influenced by supernatural forces, saying that he believed the devil had instructed him to kill the Sitar family. While his claims were unusual and difficult to verify, they raised serious questions about his mental state. Psychiatrists examined him thoroughly and concluded that he was suffering from a severe psychiatric disorder, casting doubt on his capacity to fully understand his actions. Rexcosi's trial began on March 23, 1932, in the province of Manitoba. The case drew intense public interest, both locally and nationally, as Canadians struggled to comprehend how a trusted family member could become a mass murderer. Evidence presented during the trial included witness testimonies, the sequence of events reconstructed from the scene, and the critical statement made by 4-year-old Paul Sitar, which had pointed investigators toward Rexcosi. The jury deliberated carefully, weighing the shocking nature of the crimes alongside the mental health evaluations. After 17 hours of deliberation, the jury found Rexcosi guilty of 7 counts of murder. He was originally sentenced to death by hanging, but given the unusual circumstances surrounding his mental state and the questions about his sanity, the sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment in a secure psychiatric facility. Rexcosi spent the remainder of his life there, dying in 1960. His case became a landmark example in Canadian legal history of how mental illness could influence both motive and sentencing in violent crimes. The Sitar family murders left a lasting impact on the small community of Elma and on the broader region of Manitoba. The tragedy became a symbol of the vulnerability of even close-knit, trusted families and a cautionary tale about the dangers that can lurk within familiar faces. Today, the story is remembered as one of Canada's most chilling mass murders, studied by criminologists, historians, and true crime enthusiasts alike. The memory of the Sitar family endures through community remembrances, historical accounts, and the lessons learned about trust, mental health, and justice in the wake of unspeakable violence. Gilbert Paul Jordan, born Gilbert Paul Elsie on December 12th, 1931, came into the world in Vancouver, British Columbia. His upbringing was not one of severe poverty or extreme violence, but it was shaped by rules and restrictions that he would later rebel against. His mother was a strict Christian who banned alcohol from the family home. This early prohibition may have only deepened his curiosity for drinking, because by his teenage years, alcohol had already taken a strong hold on his life. He left school in the 8th grade and never returned to formal education. By the time he was 16, he was a daily drinker, and alcohol was already guiding his choices. This was the beginning of a lifetime struggle that would not only destroy his own future, but also take the lives of others. Without education or stability, Jordan drifted into trouble with the law, beginning a criminal record in the early 1950s. His first known conviction came in 1952, marking the start of decades of arrests for crimes ranging from theft to assault. As a young man, Jordan was already known for erratic and often aggressive behavior, especially when drinking. He seemed unable or unwilling to control himself, and over the years, his reputation as a troublemaker grew. Police encounters became common, and each new arrest added to a pattern of disregard for rules and authority. Despite the growing list of charges, most of them resulted in minimal punishment, allowing him to quickly return to the streets. Jordan's dependence on alcohol was more than a personal habit. It became part of his identity. He was known to drink extreme amounts, boasting in later years about consuming more than 50 ounces of vodka a day. Even in his early adulthood, this level of drinking made him a figure people remembered, though not always for the right reasons. During this time, he picked up various labor jobs, but rarely kept steady work. His relationships were unstable, and he often surrounded himself with others who shared his heavy drinking lifestyle. Yet beneath this chaotic surface, there were early signs of something far more dangerous, an ability to charm or disarm people just long enough to take advantage of them. These years, in the 1950s and early 1960s, would lay the foundation for the disturbing pattern he would later follow. Jordan's addiction, combined with his willingness to break the law and his growing boldness, set the stage for a method of killing, unlike anything Canadian law enforcement had seen before. But at this point, his crimes had not yet escalated to murder, at least not officially. That would come later, and when it did, it would shock the country. By the mid-1960s, Gilbert Paul Jordan had moved beyond petty crimes and drunken disturbances. His encounters with the law became more frequent and more concerning. Police reports from this period described him as unpredictable, especially when heavily intoxicated. His drinking was no longer a habit. It was a compulsion that shaped every aspect of his life. Jordan began spending much of his time in Vancouver's downtown east side, a neighborhood known for poverty, addiction, and a vulnerable population. Here he found a constant supply of drinking companions, many of whom were struggling with alcohol dependency themselves. This environment provided him with both cover for his behavior and a pool of potential victims. In 1961, Jordan was convicted of indecent assault, marking his first recorded offense that hinted at a willingness to harm others directly. Over the next decade, he accumulated more charges, including theft, assault, and disorderly conduct. While many offenders might try to stay out of trouble after multiple arrests, Jordan seemed to thrive on risk. He learned how to manipulate situations, often using his ability to drink vast amounts of alcohol as a kind of performance to impress or disarm people. By the early 1970s, his alcohol tolerance had reached a staggering level. Witnesses claimed he could consume extraordinary amounts in a single sitting without losing complete control. Jordan began using this ability in a way that would later horrify investigators, encouraging others to drink with him, sometimes in dangerous quantities. His method was subtle at first. He would buy drinks for people he met in bars or on the street, often targeting those who were already intoxicated or in need of companionship. He presented himself as a generous drinking partner, but his true intentions were far darker. In these early years, there is evidence to suggest that deaths linked to extreme alcohol consumption may have occurred around him, though no official murder charges were filed at the time. Jordan's encounters with police during this period followed a pattern: short arrests, minimal sentences, and quick releases. Law enforcement often saw him as just another chronic drunk causing trouble, unaware that his behavior was developing into something far more deliberate. By the end of the 1970s, Jordan had refined a deadly approach that relied on alcohol, both as a weapon and as a shield. It was a method that would eventually make him one of Canada's most unusual serial killers, someone who didn't need a firearm or a knife to take a life, just a bottle and a plan. In the years ahead, this pattern would escalate, leaving a trail of suspicious deaths that few initially connected to the man behind them. In the early 1980s, Gilbert Paul Jordan's drinking habit had become his signature and his weapon. By this time, he was well known in certain parts of Vancouver's downtown east side, often spotted in bars, hotels, and inexpensive rooming houses. What few people realized was that his heavy drinking sessions with women were sometimes ending in tragedy. Jordan began frequenting establishments where vulnerable women, many of them living with addiction or financial hardship, could be found. He would offer drinks, companionship, and sometimes cash. His charm was limited, but his persistence and willingness to spend money often overcame initial hesitation. Once a woman agreed to join him, Jordan's drinking challenges would begin. He would urge them to match him drink for drink, sometimes adding strong liquor to their beverages without them noticing. From 1980 to 1987, several women died in circumstances that police initially attributed to accidental alcohol poisoning. The victims shared similarities. Most were found in hotel rooms or private residences shortly after spending time with Jordan, and all had extremely high blood alcohol levels. In some cases, the levels were so high they would have been lethal to most people. At first, these incidents were treated as isolated tragedies in a neighborhood already plagued by alcohol-related deaths. Autopsies showed no signs of physical violence, and with little evidence beyond the presence of alcohol, investigators often closed the cases without further inquiry. Jordan seemed to understand this gap in law enforcement attention and used it to his advantage. During this period, witnesses occasionally reported hearing Jordan urging women to keep drinking, sometimes offering incentives or making it a competitive game. In one instance, a bartender recalled him encouraging a visibly impaired woman to have another, even when she was struggling to remain conscious. Police records show that Jordan continued to face minor charges for public drunkenness and disorderly behavior throughout these years, but none connected him directly to the deaths. The absence of overt violence allowed him to operate without serious scrutiny, even as the number of unexplained alcohol-related fatalities around him grew. By the mid-1980s, whispers about Jordan's possible involvement in these deaths began circulating among some in the community. Still, without clear evidence, law enforcement had no grounds for a serious criminal case. It would take one final, highly suspicious death to bring him into the full focus of investigators and expose the deadly pattern he had perfected over years. By late 1987, police in Vancouver began noticing troubling similarities in a series of alcohol-related deaths involving women. Reports from coroners revealed that several victims had blood alcohol levels far beyond what would normally be survivable. In more than one case, the last person seen with these women was Gilbert Paul Jordan. The turning point came in November of that year. Jordan had checked into a local hotel with a woman, and within hours, she was found dead. Her blood alcohol level was recorded at more than 4 times the legal limit for driving, a concentration considered life-threatening. Staff members recalled seeing Jordan leave the room alone, calm and unhurried. This time, however, police decided not to treat the case as just another unfortunate accident. Investigators quietly began tracking Jordan's movements. Over the course of several days, undercover officers observed him visiting bars, approaching women, and enticing them to drink heavily. They documented conversations in which he repeatedly urged the women to consume more alcohol, sometimes offering cash or making lighthearted bets to encourage them. During this surveillance period, officers intervened more than once to prevent potential tragedies. In one incident, they entered a hotel room to find a woman unconscious, with Jordan beside her. She was rushed to the hospital, where medical staff determined her blood alcohol level was dangerously high, but not yet fatal. This confirmed the suspicion that his behavior was not coincidental, but deliberate. Police soon gathered enough evidence to connect Jordan to multiple suspicious deaths dating back several years. The challenge was that the manner of killing, forcing or persuading victims to consume lethal amounts of alcohol, was legally complex to prosecute, especially since there were rarely physical signs of assault. Still, investigators pressed forward, compiling a case that would focus on the most recent incidents, where evidence and witness testimony were strongest. By the end of November 1987, Jordan was arrested and formally charged in connection with the death of one woman and the attempted killings of several others. His arrest made headlines across Canada, shocking the public with the unusual and unsettling nature of his alleged crimes. While the details would emerge more fully in court, it was already clear that the authorities had finally cornered a man who had managed to operate in plain sight for years without serious consequence. The trial of Gilbert Paul Jordan began in early 1988. Prosecutors focused on his pattern of behavior, presenting evidence from the hotel surveillance, witness statements, and coroner reports. They emphasized how Jordan had repeatedly supplied alcohol to vulnerable women, resulting in fatal overdoses, and how police had intervened to prevent additional deaths. The courtroom heard how his actions over more than 2 decades created a deadly pattern that distinguished him from accidental cases of alcohol poisoning. Jordan pleaded not guilty, maintaining that the deaths were unintentional and that he had no criminal intent. The defense argued that the women were responsible for their own alcohol consumption. However, the prosecution successfully used similar fact evidence, showing a consistent pattern of behavior across multiple incidents. This approach allowed the jury to see a clear link between Jordan's actions and the deaths, demonstrating that the fatalities were not isolated accidents. After several weeks of testimony, the jury returned a verdict in late 1988. Gilbert Paul Jordan was found guilty of manslaughter in the death of Vanessa Lee Buckner, as well as charges related to the attempted deaths of other women. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, though his sentence was later reduced on appeal. He served 6 years before being released on parole in 1994. Despite the relatively short prison term, Jordan's case remained a stark example of the legal challenges in prosecuting deaths caused indirectly by a perpetrator. The impact of the case extended beyond the courtroom. It raised awareness of how marginalized communities, particularly Indigenous women struggling with addiction, could be systematically overlooked by authorities. Public debate focused on the responsibility of society to protect vulnerable populations and the need for better investigative procedures. Jordan's ability to evade serious charges for so long highlighted significant gaps in policing, law enforcement coordination, and social services. Gilbert Paul Jordan died in 2006 from health complications related to his long-term alcoholism. While he was never convicted of murder, his legacy remains one of infamy in Canadian criminal history. The case continues to be studied by criminologists, law enforcement, and advocates for vulnerable communities as a warning of how easily predators can exploit societal neglect. Ultimately, the story of Gilbert Paul Jordan is not just about a single man, but about systemic failures, overlooked victims, and the importance of vigilance in protecting those most at risk. His crimes serve as a reminder of the dark consequences when society fails to act, leaving vulnerable people exposed to harm for far too long. Barbara Elaine Chapman lived in a quiet home just north of the small village of Frankford in Ontario, Canada. Frankford was a peaceful rural town near the shores of the Trent River. According to the census taken in the year 1971, the village had a population of just over 1,800 people. It was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other and crime was almost unheard of. Barbara was 38 years old in the winter of 1984. She was a mother of 2 young children, and her life centered around her family. Those who knew her described her as kind, thoughtful, and devoted to her children. Her home was not far from the edge of town, tucked away in a quiet area that felt safe, even in the middle of winter. On the morning of Monday, January 23rd, Barbara woke up early to begin her usual routine. The snow had settled overnight, but the roads were clear enough for the school bus to make its way through the rural route. She helped her 2 children get ready for school, prepared breakfast for them, and made sure they were dressed for the cold January weather. After walking them outside and seeing them off as they boarded the school bus, Barbara returned to the house. It was the last time anyone would see her alive. Shortly after the children left, Barbara called her mother. The two had a friendly conversation while Barbara tidied up around the home. She had no known appointments or visitors expected that day. Nothing seemed unusual at that point. The call ended with nothing out of the ordinary, and Barbara was alone inside the house. At some point after the phone call, something happened that would change everything. and whatever took place during those next few hours remains one of Ontario's most troubling mysteries. There were no neighbors who reported any suspicious activity that morning, and no one came forward with information about seeing visitors or strangers near the Chapman home. The day continued quietly until Barbara's 12-year-old daughter arrived home from school around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. She expected to find her mother at home, like always, but the house was unusually silent. As she moved from room to room, calling out for her mother, she realized something was wrong. After searching for some time and finding no sign of Barbara, she eventually walked out to the garage. That was where she discovered her mother's body. Authorities were called, and investigators soon arrived at the home. The scene was carefully examined, and Barbara's death was determined to be a homicide. The cause of death, however, was not released to the public. To this day, investigators have never shared exactly how Barbara was killed. The lack of that detail has left the case clouded in uncertainty and has added to the mystery that surrounds it. What followed was an intense investigation that would last for decades. But in those first hours and days after Barbara's murder, no clear answers were found. The community of Frankfurt, once known for its quiet streets and peaceful way of life, was shaken to its core. In the days following the murder of Barbara Elaine Chapman, the Ontario Provincial Police launched a full investigation. Officers from the Criminal Investigation Branch, also known as the CIB, were brought in to assist. The seriousness of the case was immediately recognized, and investigators began gathering as much information as possible from the Chapman home and the surrounding area. One of the first steps was to speak with anyone who had been in contact with Barbara in the hours leading up to her death. Her last known conversation had taken place with her mother, but beyond that, there were no confirmed reports of visitors or deliveries that morning. Because Barbara lived in a more isolated part of town, there were no close neighbors who could report having seen or heard anything unusual. Forensic specialists from the Center of Forensic Sciences were brought in to help examine the scene. While certain findings were made, very little information was shared publicly. To this day, the official cause of death has never been released, and it is still unclear whether investigators withheld it for strategic reasons or due to the sensitivity of the case. Over time, law enforcement conducted numerous interviews with residents in and around Frankfurt. The community remained cooperative, but no one came forward with any substantial information that could point to a suspect. People in town began to grow uneasy. The idea that someone capable of such a crime could still be among them created an undercurrent of fear and suspicion. Authorities also explored Barbara's personal life for any signs of conflict or unresolved issues. They reviewed her routines, examined her relationships, and searched for any link that might lead to a motive. But there were no known threats, no history of domestic issues, and no clear indication of someone who would want to harm her. In many ways, the investigation was dealing with a case that had no obvious starting point. Despite their efforts, the investigators were working with limited evidence. This was the early 1980s, long before the advances in DNA technology and digital surveillance. With no eyewitnesses and no apparent motive, progress was slow. The longer the case remained unsolved, the more difficult it became to trace back the events of that January day. Several tips did come in over the following months, and each one was pursued carefully. A few names were mentioned, and some individuals were questioned, but none of those leads resulted in charges. In each case, the evidence was either lacking or too inconclusive to move forward. Barbara's murder soon became one of the many cold cases in Ontario. It was not forgotten by investigators, but the file began to gather dust as newer cases came in. Still, her family continued to hold out hope for answers, and law enforcement remained open to revisiting the case if new information emerged. Through the years, the Ontario Provincial Police would occasionally re-examine the file, especially when advancements in forensic tools became available. But each review came with the same result: no arrests, no official suspects, and no resolution. The mystery surrounding Barbara's death deepened as time passed. With each year that went by, it became more difficult to retrace the events of that winter morning in the small town of Frankfurt. Years after the murder of Barbara Elaine Chapman, her case remained unsolved, but it was never officially closed. The Ontario Provincial Police kept it classified as an open homicide investigation. From time to time, the file was reviewed by officers with fresh eyes, and new investigative techniques were applied as technology advanced. One of the most significant changes came with the evolution of forensic science. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, law enforcement across Canada began re-examining cold cases with the help of improved DNA analysis and trace evidence procedures. Barbara's case was included in this wave of renewed interest, and forensic evidence collected at the scene was re-evaluated. However, nothing publicly confirmed ever suggested that a match was found, and no suspects were named. In the early 2010s, the Ontario Provincial Police Criminal Investigation Branch made another push. Working alongside the Office of the Chief Coroner and the Centre of Forensic Sciences, the case was reopened for deeper review. Investigators followed up on past leads, re-interviewed individuals, and attempted to identify any possible witnesses who had not come forward at the time. Despite this effort, no new breakthroughs were announced. As years passed without answers, interest in the case returned during discussions around other high-profile crimes in the area. One of those cases involved former Canadian military colonel Russell Williams, who was arrested in February of the year 2010. Williams had been based at Canadian Forces Base Trenton, located less than 15 kilometers from Frankfurt. His crimes had shocked the country, and his double life as a respected officer and violent offender led to public speculation about other unsolved crimes in the region. At the time of Barbara's murder in January of the year 1984, Russell Williams was a university student in Scarborough. He did not join the Canadian Armed Forces until 3 years later. Official sources have never connected Williams to Barbara Chapman's death, and there is no indication that he has ever been investigated in relation to her case. He has never been charged with anything connected to her murder, and authorities have made no public comments about any possible link. Outside of speculation, no suspect has ever been publicly named in Barbara's case. Over time, several theories have circulated among locals and amateur investigators. Some believed that the isolated nature of her home may have made her a target of opportunity. Others questioned whether the crime was random, or if someone familiar with her routines had taken advantage of a window of time when she was alone. There was also discussion around whether her case could be connected to any other unsolved crimes in the region. However, no conclusive patterns or links were ever established. Without additional evidence or a confession, the case has remained in the realm of mystery. Barbara's name has occasionally surfaced in media reports and public appeals for information, especially on anniversaries of her death. Law enforcement has repeatedly asked that anyone with information, no matter how small, come forward. Despite all these efforts, the murder of Barbara Chapman remains one of Ontario's most difficult unsolved cases. The silence surrounding what happened that day has endured for more than 4 decades. In the decades that have followed the murder of Barbara Elaine Chapman, her case has stood as a lasting reminder of how a life can be stolen without warning, and how justice can remain painfully out of reach. Though many years have passed since that cold January day in the year 1984, the investigation into her death has never officially been closed. The Ontario Provincial Police, in collaboration with the Criminal Investigation Branch, continues to consider the case active. The agency has confirmed that it has followed up on many leads over the years, some originating from the public, and others emerging from periodic case reviews. Each tip is evaluated carefully, even if it does not immediately result in new developments. Police have emphasized that it takes only one piece of overlooked information to break open a case, and they have not given up hope that someone, somewhere, might hold that piece. One challenge that continues to face investigators is the limited physical evidence available from the original scene. In the early 1980s, forensic tools were not as advanced as they are today. While some materials were collected at the time, including potential trace evidence, there has been no confirmation that any of it has produced new leads through modern testing. Without any publicly confirmed DNA matches or conclusive witness accounts, the mystery has endured. In more recent years, advancements in forensic genealogy, a method that uses public DNA databases to trace unidentified suspects through their relatives, have played a key role in solving cold cases across North America. While it is not known if this technique has been applied to Barbara's case, the growing interest in this investigative tool has offered renewed optimism for many cold case detectives. Should suitable DNA be available, it may provide one of the last viable paths to identifying a suspect. Meanwhile, in Frankfurt and surrounding communities, Barbara's story continues to be remembered. Local media outlets and online forums have featured her case from time to time, especially on the anniversary of her death. These reports often include appeals from law enforcement and highlight the impact her murder had on her children and those who knew her. Barbara was more than a name in a report. She was a mother, a daughter, and a friend. Her sudden death left 2 children without their mother and created a wound that has never fully healed. Despite the silence from those responsible, the community has not forgotten her. Candles have been lit, memorials have been held, and conversations continue, all in the hope that one day there will be answers. The murder of Barbara Elaine Chapman remains one of Ontario's most haunting unsolved crimes. With every passing year, the urgency of finding justice grows stronger. For her family, for her memory, and for the community that has waited so long, the search continues. The Ontario Provincial Police still encourage anyone with information, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, to come forward. Even after more than 40 years, it is never too late to speak up. In the early hours of October 2nd, 2003, a quiet apartment building on Mountain Avenue in Winnipeg, Manitoba, became the scene of one of the city's most haunting unsolved murders. Inside a modest third-floor suite, 3 young children were asleep, unaware that their lives were about to change forever. Their mother, 32-year-old Nicolle Hands, was awake only a room away, facing an unimaginable terror that would end her life. At around 3:30 in the morning, neighbors later recalled hearing noises, a struggle, a woman's voice, and then silence. Within minutes, a babysitter inside the home, along with Nicolle's eldest child, discovered that something terrible had happened. When police and paramedics arrived, they found a chaotic and devastating scene. Nicolle had been violently attacked and left critically injured. The children, frightened and confused, were quickly taken from the apartment as emergency crews worked to save her life. She was rushed to the hospital in grave condition, and detectives from the Winnipeg Police Service Homicide Unit were immediately called to the scene. There were no signs of forced entry, which led investigators to believe that Nicolle had willingly allowed her attacker inside. The building's hallways were quiet, and no one had seen a stranger enter or leave at that hour. Word of the attack reached Nicolle's family hundreds of miles away in Kingston, Ontario. Her mother, Eleanor, received a call from a doctor at the hospital, explaining that her daughter had been found unresponsive after a violent assault. Eleanor pleaded with him to keep Nicolle alive until she could arrive. She traveled to Winnipeg as quickly as possible, bringing Nicolle's 2 oldest children with her. The hospital room was filled with heartbreak, a mother's desperate hope, and 2 young children who could barely comprehend what had happened to their mom. Nicolle survived for 3 days, but her injuries were too severe. On October 5th, 2003, she passed away in the hospital, surrounded by family. Her death officially transformed the investigation from an assault into a homicide. Police began canvassing the area, collecting statements, and searching for anyone who might have seen or heard something that night. But as the hours turned into days, no suspect was identified, and no one had a clear explanation of what led to the attack. That early morning on Mountain Avenue, marked the beginning of a case that would confound detectives for decades. A young mother was gone, 3 children were left without their parent, and a community was left to wonder who could have committed such an act. The answers would prove to be elusive, and the mystery of what happened to Nicolle Hands would haunt Winnipeg for years to come. Before her name became tied to one of Manitoba's most mysterious unsolved murders, Nicolle Catherine Hands was known simply as a devoted mother and a loving friend. Born in Kingston, Ontario, in 1971, she was remembered as kind, warm, and determined. Friends said Nicolle had a quiet strength, the sort of resilience that showed through in her ability to handle life's challenges without complaint. After moving to Winnipeg, she built a new life for herself and her 3 young children, determined to provide stability and safety in a city that, while not without its dangers, offered her a fresh start. Nicolle lived in a small 3rd-floor apartment at 271 Mountain Avenue, a modest building in Winnipeg's North End. The area was working class, with narrow streets, older homes, and an eclectic mix of families and tenants. Neighbors often saw Nicolle walking her children to nearby schools or chatting with residents in the stairwell. She had recently started working part-time, balancing her schedule between her job, raising her kids, and trying to maintain some sense of normalcy. To most who knew her, she was quiet but friendly, a woman who stayed focused on her children and avoided trouble. However, in the months leading up to October of 2003, Nicolle confided in a few close friends that she had been receiving unwanted attention. Some reports later suggested that she knew her attacker, though police never publicly confirmed this detail. Those close to her recalled that she sometimes seemed uneasy at night and occasionally mentioned feeling as though she was being watched. Despite this, she tried not to show fear in front of her children. Her priority was always them, making sure they felt safe and loved inside their small apartment. Investigators later learned that the days before the attack had been relatively routine for Nicolle. She'd gone grocery shopping, taken her children to a local park, and made phone calls to family back in Ontario. Everything about her life appeared stable. On the evening before the assault, she reportedly spoke with her mother, Eleanor, over the phone. They discussed normal things, the kids, work, and plans for the upcoming holidays. Nothing in that conversation suggested that Nicolle sensed any danger. It would be the last time Eleanor ever heard her daughter's voice. When detectives began piecing together her final hours, they faced an unsettling realization. There were no signs of a break-in, and nothing of value had been stolen. Whoever had entered Nicolle's apartment had likely been someone she trusted enough to let inside. Police began conducting interviews with neighbors, friends, and former acquaintances, hoping to trace Nicolle's recent interactions. Some neighbors said they heard muffled voices late at night, while others mentioned seeing an unfamiliar man in the hallway days earlier, a detail investigators could never fully verify. In the early stages of the investigation, police considered several possibilities. Was this a targeted attack motivated by personal conflict or a random act of violence? The absence of forced entry and theft suggested intent beyond robbery. Forensic investigators processed the apartment carefully, gathering fibers, fingerprints, and biological evidence using techniques available at the time. But early DNA analysis in the early 2000s was still developing, and the samples collected did not lead to an immediate match in any known database. By the end of October 2003, detectives had interviewed more than 30 individuals and reviewed countless tips, yet no suspect had been charged. Every detail of Nicolle's final days, from her grocery runs to her final phone call, was dissected in hopes of finding the missing link. For her family, the lack of progress was agonizing. They knew Nicolle's life had been simple and centered on her children, which made her murder all the more inexplicable. As weeks turned into months, the unanswered questions grew heavier. Who had Nicolle let into her home that night? And what had happened in those quiet hours before the attack? And why, after so much investigation, did no one seem to have seen or heard the person responsible? For Winnipeg police, the case was far from over. But already, the haunting silence surrounding Nicolle's murder had begun to set in. On the morning of October 4th, 2003, the quiet of Winnipeg's North End was broken by a chilling discovery inside a modest apartment building at 271 Mountain Avenue. Nicolle Hands' lifeless body was found in her third-floor suite by a concerned relative who had stopped by after being unable to reach her for several days. The scene that awaited first responders was deeply unsettling. There were no signs of forced entry, suggesting that Nicolle either knew her killer or had willingly allowed them inside. Nothing valuable was missing, ruling out robbery as a motive. For investigators, it was clear from the start. This was a personal, deliberate act. Paramedics arrived quickly, but could do nothing to help. Winnipeg Police Service officers sealed off the entire floor, turning the small apartment into an active crime scene. Neighbors were questioned immediately. Many recalled hearing nothing unusual. No screams, no arguments, just the typical creaks and muffled noises of the aging building. A few remembered seeing Nicolle's children being taken away safely to stay with family members, while others said police moved in and out of the suite for hours, carefully collecting evidence. Within hours, the investigation had officially begun, one that would span years without resolution. Forensic teams worked methodically through the apartment. They documented every item, photographed every angle, and searched for fingerprints and DNA evidence using techniques available in the early 2000s. Blood pattern analysis and fiber collection were carried out in detail. Investigators collected clothing, personal items, and a series of small samples that could later be tested for DNA. At that time, however, DNA databases in Canada were still in their infancy, and technology lacked the precision it would gain a decade later. The samples were preserved, but results were limited. Still, detectives believed the key to solving Nicolle's case could one day be found within that evidence. Police spokespeople assured the public that the homicide was being treated with the highest priority. Detectives canvassed nearby apartments and the surrounding neighborhood for witnesses, hoping that someone had seen an unfamiliar person entering or leaving the building around the time of Nicolle's death. A few neighbors mentioned a man seen in the hallway in the days before the discovery, described only as tall, wearing dark clothing and possibly carrying a duffel bag. Unfortunately, this vague description was not enough to build a clear suspect profile. No one had seen the man enter or leave Nicolle's specific apartment on the night of the crime. The media began to cover the story widely across Manitoba. Headlines described the tragedy as both horrifying and deeply mysterious. Reporters noted how little police were saying publicly, and rumors quickly began to circulate. Some speculated about domestic issues or possible connections to acquaintances Nicolle had mentioned feeling uncomfortable around. Others theorized it might have been a random attack, though that seemed unlikely given the absence of forced entry. The case stirred unease throughout Winnipeg, particularly among residents in the North End who worried about an unknown killer still at large. Detectives soon brought in specialists from other divisions of the Winnipeg Police Service to assist. Criminal profilers were consulted, hoping to develop behavioral insights into the possible suspect. The lack of theft and the manner in which the apartment had been left suggested someone acting out of emotion, possibly anger, resentment, or obsession. This indicated the killer may have had a personal connection to Nicolle. Yet without hard evidence, police were left to rely on instinct and deduction. Dozens of interviews were conducted, and multiple people of interest were identified, but none could be conclusively linked to the crime. Meanwhile, forensic analysts continued processing the evidence. Technicians compared hair fibers, analyzed trace material, and examined possible fingerprints lifted from surfaces inside the apartment. Some prints belonged to Nicolle and her children, while others could not be matched to anyone in existing police databases. The uncertainty added frustration for investigators, who believed they were close to a breakthrough, but could not yet tie any single individual to the scene beyond doubt. By the end of 2003, the case had hit its first major stall. Despite extensive forensic work, neighborhood canvassing, and hundreds of investigative hours, no suspect had been charged. Police confirmed to local media that the case remained open and active, but behind the scenes, leads were drying up. The tragedy of Nicolle Hands' death had left a void in her family and a mystery in the city of Winnipeg, one that only deepened as winter set in and the case grew colder with each passing week. As the years passed, Nicolle Hands' murder remained unsolved, becoming one of Winnipeg's most haunting cold cases. The file, meticulously compiled by the Winnipeg Police Service, sat largely inactive for nearly a decade. Investigators had pursued every lead possible at the time, but the combination of limited forensic technology and uncooperative witnesses stalled progress. Many in the community feared that the killer might never be identified, and Nicolle's family struggled with the ongoing uncertainty. Her mother, Eleanor, kept a careful record of every development, saving clippings, police updates, and personal notes, a private archive of grief and determination. In 2012, a renewed effort came with the formation of Project Devote, a joint task force of the Winnipeg Police Service and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. This initiative focused specifically on cold cases involving missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. For Nicolle's case, Project Devote brought new resources, fresh investigators, and modern forensic techniques that had advanced significantly since 2003. Detectives re-interviewed former witnesses, visited the crime scene, and reviewed every piece of evidence with modern standards in mind. Even decades-old DNA samples were re-examined using more sophisticated testing methods. Investigators worked carefully to reconstruct Nicolle's social life in the months leading up to her death. They looked into her friendships, past relationships, and any known conflicts that could indicate a motive. Attention was paid to her involvement in Winnipeg's North End community, her connections through work, and interactions with people she trusted. Police also focused on her financial dealings, attempts to resolve personal disputes, and any indications of threats she might have received. Each detail was examined to build a clearer picture of her final days. Witness cooperation remained a challenge. Many people who had known Nicolle or been around her social circle in 2003 were reluctant to speak. Fear of reprisal, ongoing involvement in illicit activities, or mistrust of authorities created significant barriers. To overcome this, Project Devote investigators worked closely with community organizations to encourage safe reporting and provide assurance that any information would be confidential. They also reviewed statements collected during the original investigation, seeking inconsistencies or overlooked clues that might now be relevant. In addition to witness interviews, the task force employed behavioral analysis techniques to narrow potential suspects. Profilers assessed the likelihood that Nicolle's killer had a personal connection, given the lack of forced entry and the nature of the attack. They compared her case with other unresolved homicides in Manitoba, looking for patterns that could indicate a serial offender or someone with a history of violence. Investigators also traced people of interest who had been close to Nicolle around the time of her death, verifying alibis and searching for any inconsistencies. Technological advancements played a significant role in reopening the case. Crime scene photos were enhanced, fingerprints reanalyzed, and trace evidence retested using modern equipment. Digital mapping of the neighborhood and cell phone records were used to identify individuals in proximity to Nicolle's apartment on October 2nd, 2003. Investigators hoped that these modern tools could reveal something missed in the original probe. By 2014, Project Devote had conducted in-person interviews with Nicolle's surviving children, now young adults, and her mother Eleanor, traveling to Kingston to gather first-hand accounts. Their recollections, combined with the re-examined forensic evidence, provided new insights. Though no immediate arrest was made, investigators believed they had narrowed the suspect pool and were closer than ever to uncovering the truth. Despite these efforts, the case remained unsolved, highlighting the challenges inherent in cold cases involving intimate knowledge, fear, and limited evidence. Project Devote's work, however, ensured that Nicolle's story was never forgotten. The dedication of investigators and the persistence of her family kept the case active and visible, preserving hope that one day the person responsible for Nicolle Hands' death would be identified and held accountable. After years of painstaking investigation, Project Devote made a significant development in March of 2020. Investigators arrested a Winnipeg man in connection with Nicolle Hands' murder. This moment brought a surge of hope to her family, especially her mother Eleanor, who had been waiting for answers for nearly 17 years. For Nicolle's 3 children, now adults, the news felt like a long-awaited opportunity to finally confront the past. The arrest indicated that persistent investigative work, combined with modern forensic methods and community engagement, could bring new leads even decades after a crime. Despite the excitement surrounding the arrest, the relief was short-lived. Within 24 hours, the suspect was released due to insufficient evidence to formally charge him with Nicolle's murder. Investigators and Crown prosecutors concluded that although the man fit aspects of the description and had potential connections to Nicolle's life, the case lacked the concrete proof required for a conviction. The sudden reversal was devastating for Nicolle's family, reopening old wounds and emphasizing the difficulties of achieving justice in cold cases. Eleanor described the moment as heartbreaking, particularly when she had to inform her grandchildren that the man they thought responsible was now free. The case highlighted several challenges inherent in investigating crimes like Nicolle's. The lack of forced entry suggested she knew her attacker, but the fear and silence within the community made it difficult to gather first-hand accounts. Witnesses often hesitated to come forward due to fear of retaliation or distrust of law enforcement. Investigators also faced limitations imposed by the passage of time. Memories faded, evidence degraded, and potential suspects or witnesses moved away or passed on. These factors collectively made it difficult to create a fully substantiated case, even with the advantage of modern forensic techniques. Before the arrest, the Winnipeg Police Service had announced a restructuring, removing officers from the Project Devote task force to form an internal cold case unit. While collaboration between the RCMP and the local police continued, the change created uncertainties and slowed some investigative processes. The team worked under the understanding that every lead might be critical, but organizational changes inevitably affected the pace and strategy of the investigation. Despite these obstacles, authorities maintained a commitment to keeping Nicolle's case active, demonstrating the enduring importance of her story within the broader context of unsolved crimes against Indigenous women in Canada. Tragically, in late 2023, the primary suspect passed away. With his death, the possibility of achieving justice through a traditional conviction disappeared. For Eleanor and Nicolle's children, this loss underscored the limits of the legal system in cases where time, fear, and evidence constraints intersect. While the police consider the case technically still open, the reality is that the chance of a courtroom resolution is gone. However, investigators continue to hope that someone with information might step forward, even decades later, to help provide answers and closure to Nicolle's family. The unresolved nature of Nicolle's murder has kept public attention focused on the broader crisis of violence against Indigenous women in Canada. Her story is cited frequently in discussions about systemic challenges, the need for improved reporting, and community support. It serves as a stark reminder of the importance of dedicated investigative resources and the persistence required to tackle cold cases. Advocates argue that unresolved murders like Nicolle's emphasize the need for ongoing reforms in law enforcement and justice systems to prevent similar tragedies in the future. Nicolle's family continues to hold out hope for closure. Eleanor has made direct appeals to anyone with information, urging them to contact authorities and help bring some peace to a family that has waited far too long. Community leaders and Indigenous advocacy groups echo this plea, encouraging anyone with knowledge to come forward. While the path to justice may never be complete, the story of Nicolle Hands remains a powerful call for awareness, accountability, and the relentless pursuit of answers. Through all of the setbacks, Nicolle's memory endures as a reminder of a young mother taken too soon. Her life, her struggles, and her enduring love for her children continue to resonate. The case may be unsolved, but the dedication of her family, the investigators, and the community ensures that she is not forgotten. In the end, the story of Nicolle Hands is not just about a crime. It is about persistence, remembrance, and the hope that someday truth will prevail. Though the primary suspect in Nicolle Hands' murder has passed away, the case remains officially open with the Winnipeg Police Service. Investigators continue to monitor any potential leads, no matter how small, understanding that even decades later, new information can emerge. The ongoing attention highlights the importance of cold case units and the dedicated officers who tirelessly review files, interview witnesses, and analyze old evidence with modern technology. Each effort, whether reviewing surveillance footage, forensic materials, or witness statements, is aimed at answering the most pressing question: who killed Nicolle Hands and why? For Nicolle's family, the years of uncertainty have been a profound struggle. Her mother, Eleanor, has spoken openly about the emotional toll, describing the mix of hope and despair that has defined life since October of 2003. She has become an advocate for families of missing and murdered Indigenous women, emphasizing the critical need for systemic reform in how these cases are investigated. Eleanor's dedication to keeping Nicolle's story alive has inspired many in Manitoba and beyond to support victims' families and to encourage anyone with knowledge of such crimes to come forward. The tragedy of Nicolle Hands also sheds light on broader societal challenges. Cases involving Indigenous women often face additional barriers, including systemic bias, fear of retaliation, and community mistrust of law enforcement. These obstacles complicate investigations, delaying justice and leaving families in prolonged states of grief. Nicolle's story exemplifies the intersection of personal tragedy and social inequities, serving as a case study in the urgent need for increased awareness, resources, and community engagement. Her murder is a reminder that true crime is not just about sensational stories. It is about real people, families, and communities impacted by violence. In Winnipeg, Nicolle's 3 children continue to navigate life carrying the memory of their mother. As young adults, they have shared their experiences with investigators, journalists, and advocacy groups, hoping that their voices might help uncover answers. The children's willingness to speak openly about the case has provided investigators with perspectives that were unavailable at the time of the murder. It also ensures that Nicolle's story is remembered as more than a headline. It is a personal and ongoing narrative of love, loss, and the pursuit of truth. While no one will ever know the full details of Nicolle's final moments, her legacy endures in the lives of her children and the work of those dedicated to solving cold cases. Community outreach programs and Indigenous advocacy organizations continue to honor her memory, highlighting the urgent need to protect vulnerable populations and prevent future tragedies. Each anniversary of her death serves as a call to action, reminding authorities and the public alike that unresolved cases require vigilance and care. The story of Nicolle Hands has become emblematic of the broader movement to address violence against Indigenous women in Canada. For those following the investigation, the hope remains that someone, somewhere, may hold crucial information. Even decades after the crime, new technology, witness recollections, or previously overlooked evidence could provide breakthroughs. The police encourage the public to contact them if they know anything, reinforcing that it is never too late to come forward. Every piece of information, no matter how small, could contribute to finally bringing closure to Nicolle's family and holding the responsible party accountable. In reflecting on this case, it becomes clear that Nicolle Hands' story is about more than a crime. It is about resilience, memory, and the ongoing struggle for justice. While the legal system may never fully deliver the answers her family sought, their advocacy and determination ensure that Nicolle will not be forgotten. Her life and the mystery surrounding her death continue to inspire action, awareness, and a commitment to justice for others who have suffered similar fates. In the end, the case stands as a poignant reminder of the importance of remembering victims, supporting families, and relentlessly pursuing the truth. Though the investigation may face limits imposed by time and circumstance, the impact of Nicolle Hands' life and the efforts to uncover her story persist. Her memory motivates investigators, communities, and families to never give up hope. It is a story that speaks to the power of perseverance, the necessity of vigilance, and the enduring demand for justice in the face of tragedy. Nicolle Hands remains at the center of Manitoba's unsolved mysteries, a symbol of both loss and the relentless pursuit of answers that define the human quest for closure. In the far north of Saskatchewan, the town of Buffalo Narrows sits surrounded by dense boreal forests and frozen lakes, a place where life moves slowly and everyone knows their neighbors. In the late 1960s, the population was just over 700, making it a tight-knit community. The Peterson family was well known in town. Thomas Peterson and his wife Bernadette were in their early 30s, raising a family of 7 children. Their modest 2-room home was a hub of daily life, with children playing in the snow outside in winter and helping with household chores during the warmer months. The Pedersons were respected for their faith and their commitment to the community. They were Roman Catholic and participated actively in local events and church services. Life in Buffalo Narrows was shaped by the harsh northern winters, with temperatures regularly dropping well below freezing. Residents relied on one main road that could often be blocked by snow, making the town feel isolated from the rest of Saskatchewan. On the night of January 30th, 1969, the town was blanketed in deep winter darkness. Most families were asleep early, and snow muffled the usual sounds of the small settlement. The Pedersen children had a rare break from their normal routine. 2 of the older girls, Connie and Cynthia, were staying at their grandmother's house for a sleepover. This small detail would later prove critical. Inside the Peterson home, the family's youngest children were tucked into their beds. The house was quiet, lit only by a small kerosene lamp in the kitchen, and the wind whispered outside through the cracks in the windows. In this peaceful setting, the foundations of the family's safe, ordinary life were about to be shattered by events that would shock the entire community. In the dead of night, on January 30th, 1969, 19-year-old Frederick Moses MacCallum left his small home in Buffalo Narrows. He had been living on the edge of town, doing day labor and struggling with serious mental health issues that were known to some in the community. That evening, MacCallum carried a long-handled fire axe and moved deliberately through the snow-covered streets toward the Peterson house. The night was bitterly cold, with temperatures reaching around 40 degrees below zero, and a strong wind carried the sound of footsteps across the frozen land. Inside the Peterson home, the youngest children were asleep, unaware of the danger approaching. MacCallum entered the house and attacked with a chilling precision. Thomas and Bernadette Pedersen were killed, along with a family friend who was staying overnight, Jean-Baptiste Herman, aged 48. In the second bedroom, 5 of the Peterson children were found injured. The small figure of 7-year-old Fred Donald Pedersen would later be discovered alive, having survived despite serious injuries. When the Royal Canadian Mounted Police arrived later that morning, they were met with a scene that stunned even seasoned officers. Snow crunched underfoot as they approached the home, and the cold air seemed to amplify the silence of the settlement. It was immediately clear that the attack had been confined to the house. Nothing in the surrounding area had been disturbed. The RCMP set up an immediate perimeter and began gathering information from neighbors and townspeople, while ensuring the surviving child received medical attention. The investigation at that moment was both delicate and urgent. Officers knew that in a town as small as Buffalo Narrows, the killer could not have gone far. They interviewed neighbors, reviewed recent conflicts in the community, and began piecing together the movements of MacCullough. Witnesses reported seeing him leave his home that night carrying something long and heavy, moving with a deliberate, almost trance-like focus. As the morning sun struggled to rise over the frozen trees and lakes, the RCMP began planning a manhunt. Roadblocks were set up on the few roads that connected the town to the outside world. Aircraft were readied to survey the surrounding forests, while officers on foot moved through the snow in coordinated search parties. The small northern community of Buffalo Narrows watched with fear and disbelief, realizing that a tragedy of unimaginable proportions had occurred in their midst. This initial discovery and rapid police response set the stage for understanding both the killer and the shocking motives behind the attack. The residents of Buffalo Narrows were left grappling with the horrifying reality that someone from their own town could commit such an act, while the authorities faced the urgent task of preventing further violence. Frederick Moses MacCullough was 19 years old at the time of the attack, but his life had already been marked by instability and hardship. He grew up in a fragmented household as one of 9 half-siblings, each with different fathers, and experienced frequent moves between foster homes. By the age of 16, he had already spent time in youth detention for minor offenses. It was during these early years that those around him began to notice serious mental health issues. MacCullough reported hearing voices and believed that everyday objects, like radios, were communicating directly with him. After the murders, MacCullough did not flee. Instead, he calmly returned to his mother's home, where he made a phone call to the local priest. In that call, he confessed to the attack and provided details only the perpetrator could know. The priest immediately contacted the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who arrived quickly in the small northern town. MacCullough was found sitting at the kitchen table drinking tea, appearing unusually calm, given the magnitude of his actions. He reportedly expressed no remorse, and some of his statements indicated a disturbing detachment from reality. The RCMP immediately took him into custody without any resistance. They secured the scene at his residence and began a detailed interview process. Investigators noted that MacCullough's mental state was fragile, and he described his actions in ways that reflected disordered thinking. Psychiatric professionals were called in to evaluate him, and it was during this assessment that he was formally diagnosed with schizophrenia. This diagnosis explained his distorted perceptions, hallucinations, and inability to fully comprehend the consequences of his actions. Police also reviewed MacCullough's past interactions with the justice and welfare systems. Records confirmed that despite repeated signs of mental illness, he had received minimal long-term support. While in foster care, he had experienced inconsistent supervision, which may have contributed to the escalation of his condition. Officers considered these factors while preparing the case, knowing that his mental state would play a central role in the legal proceedings to follow. The residents of Buffalo Narrows were both relieved and unsettled by the quick arrest. While the immediate threat had ended, the town now faced the challenge of understanding how such a tragedy could occur in their close-knit community. Families were left grappling with grief, and local authorities began planning counseling and support for survivors. The arrest marked the end of the immediate search, but it also signaled the beginning of a complex legal and psychiatric examination that would dominate headlines in Saskatchewan for months to come. MacCullough's behavior after the arrest raised further questions about his awareness of reality. He described feeling as if he were in a trance during the attack, stating that he looked at himself in the mirror and questioned if it was really him committing the acts. These chilling reflections underscored the challenges faced by the justice system in determining culpability when mental illness was a key factor. The arrest and subsequent psychiatric evaluation would form the foundation for a case that captured national attention. Experts debated whether MacCullough could be held responsible for his actions, and the town of Buffalo Narrows braced for the trial that would follow, a trial that promised to test the limits of both the law and public understanding of mental illness in criminal cases. Frederick McCallum's trial began in the fall of 1969 and quickly became one of the most closely watched legal proceedings in northern Saskatchewan. The prosecution focused on the deaths of Thomas Pedersen and Jean-Baptiste Herman, although all 7 victims were discussed in court. From the beginning, the defense argued that MacCallum was suffering from schizophrenia, a severe mental disorder that left him unable to understand the consequences of his actions. Psychiatric experts explained in detail how he experienced hallucinations, disordered thinking, and a profound disconnection from reality, which directly influenced the tragic events of January the 30th. The jury, composed entirely of men from outside the local Indigenous community, faced the difficult task of balancing the severity of the crimes with the evidence of MacCallum's mental illness. During the proceedings, the defense presented accounts of his unstable upbringing, including years spent in foster care, early brushes with the law, and repeated signs of mental health struggles. Witnesses described his erratic behavior in the months leading up to the attack, highlighting how he had isolated himself and displayed unusual preoccupations with their voices and visions. After deliberating for 4.5 hours, the jury delivered a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity. In Canada, at the time, this legal designation meant that while MacCallum had committed the acts, he could not be held criminally responsible due to his inability to distinguish right from wrong at the time of the crime. The verdict was met with shock and confusion from the surviving family members and the wider community. Many struggled to reconcile the fact that the man who had destroyed so many lives would not spend time in prison, but instead be placed in a psychiatric institution. Following the verdict, MacCallum was sent to a secure psychiatric facility for treatment. Over the following years, he would experience transfers between institutions, including brief stays in maximum security facilities, but his diagnosis of schizophrenia remained the central factor guiding his care. Meanwhile, the surviving Peterson children faced ongoing challenges. The 2 sisters, Connie and Cynthia, were left without their parents and younger siblings, while Fred, who had survived the attack, had to cope with long-term injuries and trauma. The community of Buffalo Narrows rallied to support the survivors, but the psychological scars remained, shaping the lives of the family and neighbors for decades. The case also sparked broader discussions about mental health, the justice system, and how society treats individuals with severe psychiatric disorders. Many observers argued that MacCallum's upbringing and lack of early intervention contributed to the tragic outcome. Others focused on the need for better support systems in remote communities, where access to mental health care was limited. The trial highlighted gaps in the legal system when dealing with defendants whose crimes were intertwined with profound mental illness. Decades later, the Buffalo Narrows murders continue to be remembered as a defining event in the town's history. The case remains a cautionary example of how untreated mental illness, combined with social and institutional failures, can result in devastating consequences. Survivors and their descendants carry the memory of that night, often sharing their stories to raise awareness about mental health and the importance of early intervention. Though more than 50 years have passed since January 30th, 1969, the murders left an indelible mark on Saskatchewan. The tragedy shaped local policies, influenced psychiatric practices, and left a community grappling with the long-term effects of violence that could have been prevented. For the Peterson family, the memory of that night is a reminder of both unimaginable loss and the resilience of those who survived to tell the story. In the mid-19th century, a family of Irish Catholic immigrants settled in a quiet farming township in what was then known as Upper Canada. This place, about 25 kilometers northwest of London, Ontario, was called Biddulph Township. The family would come to be known as the Black Donnellys, and their story remains one of the most haunting and controversial true crime cases in Canadian history. The Donnellys arrived in Canada from Ireland during a time of deep struggle. Like many others, they had fled the devastating effects of the Great Famine. which began in Ireland around the year 1845 and lasted for several years. Hoping for a better life, James Donnelly and his wife Johanna made the long journey across the Atlantic and eventually found themselves settling along a dirt road in Biddulph that later came to be known as the Roman Line. This stretch of land had a high number of Irish Catholic settlers, and while it might have seemed like a welcoming place at first, tensions soon began to rise. At the heart of these tensions was land. The Donnelly family built their home on land that was originally owned by the Canada Company and had been sold to a man named James Grace. Over time, another man named Patrick Farrell came to lease a portion of this same lot, and that would mark the beginning of a long and bitter dispute. In the year 1856, a case went to court to settle who had the right to live on the land. The judge made a final decision. The northern 50 acres would go to the Donnellys, while the southern portion would be given to Farrell. Though this legally ended the dispute, the resentment between the two men did not go away. Only 1 year later, in the summer of 1857, the feud turned violent. During a barn-raising event in the area, James Donnelly and Patrick Farrell got into a fight. The details remain unclear, but by the end of it, Farrell had been fatally injured and died 2 days later. James Donnelly fled the scene and disappeared from public view. Nearly 2 years later, he turned himself in to a local justice of the peace. He was originally sentenced to hang, but thanks to a petition started by his wife Johanna, that sentence was reduced. James Donnelly served 7 years in Kingston Penitentiary. Despite having served his time, this event cast a long shadow over the Donnelly family. Whispers began to follow them through the township. Some saw them as troublemakers. Others believed they had been unfairly treated. But the truth lay somewhere in the middle. As Irish Catholic immigrants living in a mostly Protestant area, the Donnellys were already seen as outsiders. Combined with their strong personalities, clashes were almost inevitable. Over time, the Donnellys became known for standing their ground. They didn't shy away from arguments, and they were often accused, fairly or not, of theft, arson, and violence. Some of these accusations may have been based on real events. Others were likely the result of gossip, fear, and long-standing grudges. Regardless, the family developed a reputation, and that reputation made them a target. By the late 1870s, tensions in the area had reached a boiling point. A group called the Peace Society, organized by the local Catholic priest, had formed with the goal of reducing crime and restoring order. Many residents joined the group and agreed to have their homes searched for stolen goods. The Donnellys refused. That refusal, along with years of anger and suspicion, set the stage for one of the most shocking nights in Canadian history. By the time the Donnellys had settled into their homestead on the Roman Line in the mid-19th century, tensions between Irish Catholic settlers like themselves and the mainly Protestant residents of Biddulph Township were already present. These cultural and religious differences formed the foundation for a growing hostility that would continue to escalate over the following decades. The area was made up of many recent immigrants, with families arriving from Ireland, often in desperate circumstances following the Great Famine. Despite their shared heritage, divisions based on faith and class ran deep. After James Donnelly's prison sentence, the family resumed life on the farm, but their name had already been tied to violence. Rumors spread easily in small communities, and many residents viewed the Donnellys with suspicion. As their sons grew older, the family's presence became more visible and often more confrontational. Disputes over land boundaries, stolen livestock, and competition over contracts for services like stagecoach lines and roadwork placed the Donnellys in frequent conflict with neighbors. While the Donnellys were not the only family involved in such disputes, their involvement often seemed to attract the most attention and resentment. By the late 1870s, the town had become divided. While some respected the Donnellys for standing up for themselves, others saw them as instigators. Their refusal to back down from fights, both in court and in person, hardened public opinion against them. The local Catholic priest, Father John Connolly, tried to restore peace in the community by forming what was called the Peace Society in June of 1879. He encouraged parishioners at St. Patrick's Church to sign a pledge promising to allow their homes to be searched if they were suspected of harboring stolen goods. The Donnellys, however, refused to join. They saw the Peace Society as biased and politically motivated. Their refusal was viewed as defiance by many locals, and it only fueled suspicions that the family had something to hide. Not long after, a more secretive group called the Vigilance Committee emerged, formed by those who had taken the Peace Society pledge. This unofficial group began to monitor the Donnellys' movements and activities, operating in the shadows and beyond the reach of law enforcement. Tensions came to a head when the Donnellys clashed with others over stagecoach routes in the area. James Donnelly and his sons were operating a line that competed directly with another local line, and accusations of sabotage and harassment were exchanged between the rival companies. At times, coaches were vandalized or burned, and while there was never concrete proof of who was behind the attacks, fingers were often pointed at the Donnellys. As violence increased throughout the township, many residents began to feel that the legal system could no longer control the unrest. Property was destroyed, livestock was stolen or killed, and homes were set on fire. The blame did not always fall solely on the Donnellys, but they remained the center of controversy. At the same time, they continued to be targeted. Their barn was burned down on more than one occasion, and their family was frequently threatened. Through it all, the Donnellys remained outspoken. They were known for challenging those in power, including church leaders and magistrates, and they refused to leave their land. This fierce independence made them both admired and feared, but the sense that the law had failed to hold them accountable, whether real or perceived, created growing frustration among their enemies. By early February of 1880, plans to deal with the Donnellys through unofficial means were already in motion. Surveillance of their homestead had begun. The Donnellys were unaware that their lives were being watched closely by men who had decided that force was the only remaining solution. What began as social and religious tension had now become something far more dangerous. The township was moving toward a breaking point, one that would end in tragedy. On the cold night of February 4th, 1880, a group of men gathered quietly in Biddulph Township. These men, many of whom were members of the secretive Vigilance Committee, had been planning their actions in private meetings for weeks. They believed that the Donnelly family had caused enough trouble, and that justice, at least in their eyes, could no longer be served through the courts. The plan was simple and brutal. Under the cover of darkness, they would head to the Donnelly farm on the Roman line and put an end to the family's influence once and for all. Most of the men were armed with clubs and guns. Some wore disguises. They believed their actions would be supported, or at least tolerated, by much of the community. As the group approached the Donnelly house just after 2 o'clock in the morning, they were led by a man named James Carroll. Carroll was a former constable who had known the Donnellys for years. He was also part of the Peace Society and had a personal history with the family. It was Carroll who knocked on the door, pretending to arrest one of the sons, Tom Donnelly, who was not actually at the house that night. Inside were James Donnelly, his wife Johanna, their sons Thomas and John, and their niece Bridget, who had been staying with them. When the door opened, the mob stormed inside. In a matter of minutes, chaos erupted, gunshots rang out, and the house was set on fire. James Donnelly was killed first. He was struck in the head with a spade and then shot. His wife Johanna was beaten and left for dead. John Donnelly and their niece Bridget were also killed in the attack. By the time neighbors arrived and the flames were spotted, it was too late to save anyone inside. The house was nearly destroyed. What was left were the charred remains of 4 family members. Reports from those who examined the scene later confirmed that the family had not died in the fire, but had been murdered before the blaze was set. Only one family member survived the attack, William Donnelly, who had not been at the house that night. While the mob moved quickly and in darkness, there were witnesses. A young boy named Johnny O'Connor had been hiding under a bed during the attack. He had been staying with the Donnellys for the night and somehow went unnoticed by the attackers. Johnny would later provide a key eyewitness account of the events that unfolded in the house, naming some of the men involved. But the violence did not end there. Later that same night, the mob moved on to the home of William Donnelly, hoping to kill him as well. However, William had been warned in time and managed to escape. The attackers set his house on fire too, but William was already gone. News of the killings spread quickly throughout Ontario. The scale and brutality of the attack shocked the public. While many locals had long held negative views of the Donnellys, the violent nature of the murders turned the case into a national scandal. In a time when vigilante justice was not uncommon, the massacre at the Donnelly farm stood out for its planning, its ruthlessness, and its secrecy. The authorities now had no choice but to act. The community, once divided over the Donnellys, was suddenly confronted with the weight of what had happened. 4 people had been murdered in their own home, a 5th had nearly been killed, and the killers, many of them known in the area, had walked free into the night. The next phase would take place not in secret, but in the courtroom, under the watchful eye of the entire country. In the weeks following the massacre, law enforcement faced immense pressure to identify and charge those responsible for the murders. With much of the town gripped by silence and fear, the task was difficult. Still, a handful of witnesses came forward, most notably the young boy Johnny O'Connor, who had seen parts of the attack while hiding in the Donnelly house. His testimony would become the central piece of evidence for the Crown. By March of 1880, a total of 11 men had been arrested in connection with the Donnelly killings. The most notable among them was James Carroll, the former constable who had led the mob to the Donnelly home. Also charged were Thomas Ryder, John Kennedy, and several other men with ties to the Vigilance Committee. Despite the brutality of the crime, the prosecution faced significant challenges. Many in the community were unwilling to cooperate, and others feared retaliation if they spoke out. The first trial took place in London, Ontario, in October of 1880. James Carroll was the first man brought to court. The Crown relied heavily on Johnny O'Connor's eyewitness account, but the defense focused on discrediting the boy's memory, suggesting that he was too young and traumatized to recall the events clearly. Testimonies from other witnesses were vague or contradictory. Much of the evidence was circumstantial, and several key witnesses either refused to testify or changed their stories on the stand. Despite the public outrage, the jury in Carroll's first trial could not reach a unanimous decision. The result was a mistrial. A second trial was held in January of 1881. Once again, the prosecution presented Johnny O'Connor's testimony, along with other circumstantial evidence tying Carroll to the scene. But once again, the jury returned with a verdict of not guilty. Carroll walked free, and no one else was ever successfully convicted for the murders. The failure to deliver justice led to widespread disappointment. Public opinion was deeply divided. Some residents continued to believe that the Donnellys had brought violence upon themselves, while others were horrified that an entire family could be killed so brutally and that no one would be held accountable. In the years that followed, the Donnelly murders became one of the most notorious unsolved crimes in Canadian history. Books, articles, and plays were written about the family, often casting them as either victims or villains, depending on the author's perspective. The story became legend in Ontario, and the Donnelly name took on a near-mythical status, one that sparked debates about justice, revenge, and community silence. The surviving Donnelly, William, never fully recovered from the trauma. He lived the rest of his life under a cloud of suspicion and sorrow. For years, he tried to clear his family's name and push for justice, but the courts and the public had moved on. William eventually died in 1915, never seeing anyone punished for what happened to his parents, siblings, and cousin. Today, the old Donnelly homestead near Lucan is long gone, but the story of the massacre remains a powerful symbol in Canadian folklore. The case is still studied by historians, criminologists, and writers, not only because of its brutality, but also because it reflects the complex social tensions of rural communities in the 19th century. The question of how an entire town could allow such violence to happen and then let it go unpunished remains as haunting now as it did in 1880. In the early months of 2022, Winnipeg was a city like any other, but beneath its ordinary streets and neighborhoods, a darkness was about to emerge. Jeremy Skibicki, a man in his late 30s, lived quietly in an apartment building in the North Kildonan area. To neighbors, he appeared unremarkable, reserved, keeping to himself, blending into the daily rhythm of the city. Few suspected that behind closed doors, a dangerous pattern was forming, targeting some of the most vulnerable members of the community. The first warning signs were subtle, almost invisible. Women who relied on shelters and transitional housing reported encounters with a man who seemed overly persistent and inappropriate, though nothing concrete was reported to the police at the time. These early interactions would later be understood as part of a calculated pattern, a chilling prelude to what would become a series of murders. By May of 2022, the consequences of his actions became horrifyingly clear. On May 15th, a scavenger at a residential site in North Kildonan discovered human remains in a garbage bin. The scene was immediately secured by the Winnipeg Police Service, who recognized the situation as a serious homicide. This initial discovery would mark the beginning of one of the most complex investigations in the city's recent history. Police quickly identified the remains as those of Rebecca Contois, a young woman of 24 and a member of the Ochi-Chakosipi First Nation. Her disappearance had gone unreported for several days, and the community was shocked and grieving. Investigators began to piece together the last known movements of Rebecca, retracing her steps from local shelters and community centers, and noting her interactions in the days before her death. Officers also began reviewing video surveillance and witness reports around the North Kildonan area, looking for any clue that could lead to her killer. It became evident that the man responsible had carefully planned his actions, exploiting the routines and vulnerabilities of his victims. For police, the case was not just a murder investigation. It was the potential start of identifying a serial offender operating in the city. Community members and Indigenous leaders quickly rallied, providing support to law enforcement and raising awareness about the dangers faced by vulnerable women. They also emphasized the ongoing crisis of violence against Indigenous women in Winnipeg, noting that Rebecca's case was tragically part of a much larger pattern. The discovery sparked conversations about safety, systemic issues, and the urgent need for protective measures. Meanwhile, forensic teams meticulously examined the crime scene. Evidence recovered at the bin and surrounding areas provided initial clues, including items that could be linked to the suspect, though nothing definitive yet connected a person to the crime. Investigators worked tirelessly, understanding that speed and accuracy were critical to prevent further tragedy. Following the discovery of Rebecca Contois' remains, investigators began building a clearer picture of the victims targeted by Jeremy Skibicki. It became evident that he preyed specifically on Indigenous women living in vulnerable circumstances, many of whom were connected to shelters or transitional housing in Winnipeg. These women were not just statistics. They were daughters, mothers, sisters, and friends with rich, full lives tragically cut short. Rebecca Contois, aged 24, was a devoted mother with a young daughter. She had grown up as a member of the Ochi-Chakosipi First Nation and was known in her community for her kindness and resilience. Family members described her death as a devastating loss, one that left a void impossible to fill. Her life, like those of the other victims, was a reminder of the personal and human toll behind the headlines. Morgan Harris, aged 39, was another of Skibicki's victims. A mother of 5 and grandmother of 1, she was from the Long Plain First Nation. Her family described her as fun-loving, fearless, and full of life, someone who brought joy to everyone around her. Morgan often faced challenges, but her resilience and warmth made her beloved by those who knew her. Her sudden death shocked both family and community members, highlighting the vulnerability of women in her position. Mercedes Myron, aged 26, was also from the Long Plain First Nation and a mother of 2 children. Friends and family remembered her as strong, nurturing, and fiercely protective of her loved ones. In the weeks before her death, she had been sharing hopes and plans for her future, moments that would now remain frozen in time. Her loss was a profound blow to her family, leaving behind grief that would never fully heal. The 4th victim remained unidentified for some time. Indigenous leaders referred to her as Mashkode Bijikiikwe, or Buffalo Woman, as a way to honor her memory and give her a place in the community. She was later identified in March of 2025 as Ashley Shingoose from St. Teresa Point, Anishinaabe Nation. Like the other victims, Ashley had a life, connections, and a story that ended far too early. All 4 women shared circumstances that made them particularly vulnerable. They relied on support services such as shelters, food programs, and community assistance. This reliance, tragically, made them targets for Skibiki, who exploited their situations with calculated precision. Investigators noted that his pattern focused on women who were socially marginalized, emphasizing the predatory nature of his crimes. Family members and community leaders played an important role during this period, working with law enforcement to ensure the stories of the victims were not forgotten. Each woman's identity, culture, and history were recognized publicly, underscoring the human aspect of the investigation. The community's involvement also helped police piece together the victims' routines, contacts, and last known movements, forming a critical part of the investigation. After identifying the victims, Winnipeg police launched an extensive investigation to track down the perpetrator. Early evidence pointed to the possibility that the killer had a detailed knowledge of his victims' routines and the city's systems for garbage collection and disposal. Investigators began mapping each victim's last known movements, shelter visits, and contacts, hoping to find a connection that could lead to a suspect. Surveillance footage from nearby buildings and public spaces was collected, reviewed, and cross-referenced with shelter records, marking the beginning of an intense and meticulous process. By mid-May of 2022, police had identified a 37-year-old man named Jeremy Skibiki as a person of interest. He lived in an apartment building near where some of Rebecca Contois' remains were found. Officers noted that his residence matched certain patterns in the crime, including proximity to trash disposal routes and shelters frequented by the victims. A search warrant was executed on May 18th, 2022, after which Skibiki was arrested and charged with the first-degree murder of Rebecca Contois. During interrogation, Skibiki's behavior was unexpectedly cooperative, yet chilling. Within hours, he admitted to killing 3 additional women whose deaths police were not yet aware of. He described targeting women who were homeless or transient, luring them to his apartment, and then committing the murders. Investigators quickly verified his account by matching DNA evidence from his apartment and personal belongings to the victims. Items such as clothing, knives, and personal effects linked him directly to Morgan Harris, Mercedes Myron, and Ashley Shingoose. The investigation revealed the timeline of the murders. Ashley Shingoose was killed around March 15th, 2022, followed by Morgan Harris on or about May 1st, and Mercedes Myron on or about May 4th. Rebecca Contois' murder occurred on or around May 14th, 2022. Skibiki explained how he had timed the disposal of bodies to coincide with local garbage collection schedules. Police determined that the remains of Harris and Myron were dumped in dumpsters that led to the Prairie Green landfill north of Winnipeg, while Rebecca Contoise's remains were located both in a nearby dumpster and later at the Brady Road landfill. Officers also discovered that Skibicki had used online sales platforms to dispose of items connected to Ashley Shingoose, including a reversible jacket, which provided further evidence linking him to her death. The use of modern technology in combination with meticulous crime scene processing highlighted the investigative complexity of the case. Police worked with forensic experts to process each item, collecting DNA, fingerprints, and trace evidence to build a clear chain of connection. Throughout May and June of 2022, detectives conducted extensive interviews with shelter staff, friends, and acquaintances of the victims. They gathered details about who may have been in contact with the women in the weeks leading up to their deaths. Despite initial challenges, cooperation from community organizations eventually helped corroborate Skibicki's confession and establish timelines for each victim. The thoroughness of these interviews was critical in creating an airtight case for the Crown prosecutors. The investigation also examined Skibicki's past. Police discovered a documented history of violence, including prior incidents involving former partners. Social media activity painted a picture of deeply troubling beliefs, including racial hatred and disturbing views of women. Investigators noted that while he had no prior convictions for murder, the pattern of behavior suggested a highly organized and methodical individual. Jeremy Skibicki's arrest prompted a deeper examination of who he was and what motivated his crimes. Investigators and psychologists alike tried to understand how a seemingly ordinary man living in a Winnipeg apartment could commit such calculated and horrific acts. Skibicki had a documented history of violence, particularly against Indigenous women he had known personally, which indicated a long-standing pattern of abuse and prejudice. Police and forensic experts reviewed his online activity, noting a disturbing fixation on racist ideologies, misogyny, and violent content, which helped explain his targeting of vulnerable women. During court proceedings, Skibicki claimed that he believed he was acting on a divine mission, a statement examined carefully by mental health professionals. The defense presented a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia, arguing that delusions had driven him to commit the murders. However, the Crown's experts, including Dr. Gary Chimowitz, disagreed, providing evidence that Skibicki was not psychotic at the time of the killings. Instead, he was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder and substance abuse issues, combined with a highly disturbing paraphilic fixation. This diagnosis indicated that his actions were deliberate and premeditated, not the result of a temporary mental breakdown. Investigators also looked into Skibicki's personal relationships. He had lived alone for years, but police discovered he had previously been involved with women who shared similarities with his victims, often Indigenous women. These patterns, along with his online activity and history of controlling behavior, suggested that he had been grooming his environment and exploiting vulnerabilities long before the killings in 2022. His apartment became a central piece of evidence, containing objects and items directly linked to each of the victims. Forensic teams cataloged these items meticulously, ensuring that each piece would support the prosecution's case. Psychologists later testified that Skibicki's personality traits included a lack of empathy, impulsivity, and manipulative behavior. Combined with his obsession with control and dominance, these traits painted a portrait of a person capable of meticulously planning violent acts without remorse. While some reports referred to him as calm and even polite in everyday interactions, those closest to him noted a hidden intensity and volatile nature. The stark contrast between his public demeanor and private behavior made him especially dangerous. The prosecution emphasized how Skibicki selected his victims based on both opportunity and prejudice. Each woman was living in a vulnerable situation, often relying on shelters or temporary housing, which Skibicki exploited. He targeted them with precision, luring them into situations where he had complete control. His detailed knowledge of their routines and the city's disposal system allowed him to act with an alarming efficiency, highlighting the premeditated nature of his crimes. Experts also explored the social and systemic factors that allowed Skibicki to operate undetected for a period of time. Indigenous women in Winnipeg often face heightened risks due to socioeconomic disparities, systemic neglect, and barriers to accessing help. Skibicki's crimes brought national attention to these issues, prompting discussions about the need for increased protection, support, and awareness for vulnerable populations. In examining his motivations, investigators and court experts concluded that Skibicki's actions were a combination of deeply ingrained prejudice, a sense of superiority, and a compulsive need to dominate. Unlike other crimes of passion, these killings were executed with a methodical and chilling logic. Understanding his mindset became critical, not only for the trial, but also for broader law enforcement strategies aimed at preventing similar tragedies in the future. After months of meticulous investigation, the legal proceedings against Jeremy Skibicki finally began in May of 2024. The trial was held in Winnipeg and drew national attention due to the severity of his crimes and the broader implications regarding the safety of Indigenous women. Prosecutors presented an extensive body of evidence, including DNA links, digital footprints, and forensic analysis from his apartment. Each piece of evidence was carefully detailed to the jury, establishing a clear timeline of the murders of Rebecca Comtois, Morgan Harris, Mercedes Marin, and Ashley Shingoose. The prosecution emphasized that Skibicki had acted methodically, preying on vulnerable women while exploiting systemic weaknesses in social services and law enforcement oversight. During the trial, expert testimony played a crucial role in explaining Skibicki's psychological profile. Forensic psychiatrist Dr. Gary Chimowitz testified that Skibicki exhibited antisocial personality traits, substance abuse issues, and a paraphilic fixation that contributed to the killings. The defense argued that he was not criminally responsible due to mental illness, specifically paranoid schizophrenia, but the Crown's evidence refuted this claim. Chimowitz's findings, supported by other experts, made it clear that Skibicki was fully aware of his actions and their consequences, reinforcing the argument for premeditation. On July 11th, 2024, the verdict was delivered. Chief Justice Glenn Joyal found Jeremy Skibicki guilty on all 4 counts of first-degree murder. The judge described the murders as mercilessly calculated and highlighted Skibicki's extremist views and deliberate targeting of Indigenous women. Skibicki, who remained largely emotionless throughout the trial, was sentenced to 4 concurrent life sentences, with no possibility of parole for 25 years. The sentence ensured that he would not be eligible for release until he was 60 years old, providing the victims' families with a measure of justice for the first time. Following the verdict, attention shifted to the recovery of the victims' remains, a process that had been delayed for months due to limited resources and the locations of the landfills. In December of 2024, the Prairie Green landfill search began in earnest, and by March of 2025, the remains of Morgan Harris were positively identified. Later that same month, Mercedes Marin's remains were located and confirmed. These discoveries, while devastating, provided long-awaited closure for the families, allowing them to conduct proper memorials and funerals for their loved ones. The search for Ashley Shingoose's remains at the Brady Road landfill began in August of 2025, reflecting a continued commitment to honoring the victims and ensuring that no detail of the case was left unresolved. The aftermath of the trial also sparked wider public and governmental attention. Indigenous leaders and advocacy groups pushed for stronger protective measures for vulnerable populations, especially women living in precarious situations. Programs were reviewed to improve safety in shelters, address systemic discrimination, and increase collaboration between law enforcement agencies and social services. Skibicki's case became a focal point in discussions about preventing similar crimes, highlighting the need for awareness, education, and structural reform. Families of the victims expressed a mixture of relief and sorrow. While the verdict confirmed that the killer was behind bars, it could not undo the trauma endured by the victims' loved ones. Relatives described feeling a sense of validation and recognition after years of unanswered questions, but also the enduring grief of losing their mothers, daughters, and sisters. Their advocacy for justice continued, emphasizing that the case should serve as a reminder of the importance of protecting marginalized communities. In the broader context, the Skibicki case became emblematic of the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls crisis in Canada. It underscored how systemic neglect, vulnerability, and unchecked prejudices can intersect, allowing predators to commit horrific acts with relative impunity. Law enforcement agencies used the lessons learned to develop strategies for better identification of at-risk individuals and improve protocols for investigating violent crimes, targeting Indigenous women. With Jeremy Skibicki convicted and serving 4 concurrent life sentences, the story of the 2022 Winnipeg serial killings moved from the courtroom to the wider community, highlighting the profound social and cultural consequences of his crimes. The murders of Rebecca Comtois, Morgan Harris, Mercedes Myron, and Ashley Shingoose sent shockwaves across Manitoba and the entire country. Indigenous leaders emphasized that while one predator had been stopped, the broader crisis of violence against Indigenous women and girls remained urgent and unresolved. Advocates used the case to push for sustained government funding, policy reform, and community-led initiatives aimed at protecting vulnerable women and addressing systemic inequalities. The recovery of the victims' remains, completed gradually through the searches at Prairie Green Landfill and Brady Road Landfill, allowed families to conduct memorials and properly grieve. These ceremonies were both private and public, reflecting a blend of cultural practices and communal mourning. The community came together to honor the victims, emphasizing their lives, relationships, and legacies, rather than focusing solely on the horrific circumstances of their deaths. Each memorial became a symbolic reminder that these women were loved, valued, and deserving of recognition. The legal and investigative outcomes also prompted Winnipeg Police and Manitoba RCMP to reevaluate procedures for identifying and protecting at-risk populations. Changes included improved tracking of missing persons reports, enhanced communication with Indigenous communities, and better interagency cooperation to prevent individuals like Skibicki from targeting vulnerable people unchecked. Officers involved in the investigation reflected on lessons learned, acknowledging the importance of early intervention and culturally sensitive approaches in cold case investigations. On a societal level, the case ignited discussions about the intersection of racism, misogyny, and social neglect. Media coverage and public discourse highlighted the specific risks faced by Indigenous women, especially those experiencing homelessness or relying on shelters. Advocates stressed the need for culturally informed support systems, including mental health resources, secure housing, and community programs. The Skibicki case became a teaching point in law enforcement training, emphasizing the critical need to listen to marginalized communities and to act proactively when warning signs appear. Families of the victims, while experiencing a measure of closure through the conviction, continued to navigate their grief and trauma. They became vocal advocates for systemic change, attending public forums, speaking with policymakers, and participating in initiatives aimed at reducing the risk of similar tragedies. Their voices reinforced that justice is not only about punishing perpetrators, but also about protecting communities, empowering survivors, and preventing future crimes. Nationally, the 2022 Winnipeg serial killings contributed to renewed attention on the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls inquiry, reinforcing the urgent need for concrete actions and accountability. The case illustrated how systemic failures, ranging from gaps in social services to delays in law enforcement response, can compound the vulnerability of marginalized populations. It also highlighted the resilience and determination of families and communities advocating for safety, recognition, and justice. Even years after the events, the legacy of this case remains potent. Memorials, educational programs, and public awareness campaigns ensure that the stories of Rebecca, Morgan, Mercedes, and Ashley are remembered beyond headlines. Their names are now part of a broader movement demanding equity, safety, and dignity for Indigenous women across Canada. The Skibiki case, while uniquely horrifying, became a catalyst for societal reflection, advocacy, and ongoing reform, leaving a lasting imprint on Winnipeg and the nation. Amber Alyssa Tuccaro was born in January of the year 1990. She grew up in Alberta and was a proud member of the Mikisew Cree First Nation. Her family and friends remember her as a lively and outgoing young woman who loved to laugh and spend time with the people closest to her. She was known for her quick wit and a strong, independent spirit that made her stand out wherever she went. By the summer of 2010, Amber was 20 years old and fully devoted to her 14-month-old son, Jacob. She had embraced motherhood with determination, often telling family that her little boy gave her purpose and focus. Those who knew her said she doted on him, carrying him everywhere and making him the center of her world. Despite being young, she was committed to building a good life for her son. Amber's close relationship with her family was another defining part of her life. She leaned on them for support, and in return, they admired her resilience. Her mother, Vivian, often spoke of how Amber had a contagious energy that lifted the people around her. She was not perfect, but she was deeply loved and trusted by those who knew her best. That summer, Amber decided to take a short trip to Edmonton with her son and a close friend. It was meant to be an ordinary getaway, a chance to spend some time outside of Fort McMurray, where she had been living. For Amber, it was just another step in balancing young motherhood with a desire to enjoy her early 20s. What seemed like a simple trip, however, would become the starting point of one of Alberta's most haunting unsolved cases. On Tuesday, August 17th of 2010, Amber Tuccaro left Fort McMurray with her young son Jacob and a close friend. They boarded a short flight bound for Edmonton, planning what was supposed to be a brief stay in the area. To stretch their money, the group decided not to stay directly in the city. Instead, they booked a motel in Nisku, a small community south of Edmonton, only a few minutes from the airport. The plan was simple. They would spend the night in the motel and then head into Edmonton the next day to continue their trip. But on the evening of Wednesday, August 18th, Amber grew restless. She wanted to go into the city sooner rather than later. With her son left safely in the care of her friend, Amber stepped outside the motel with the idea of finding a ride to Edmonton. Witness accounts later confirmed that she was seen getting into a vehicle with an unknown man that night. It was the last time anyone saw her alive. By the next morning, when Amber did not return to the motel, her friend grew worried and phoned her mother, Vivian, to share her concerns. That call marked the beginning of the family's long search for answers. As investigators began piecing together Amber Tuccaro's final known movements, one crucial piece of evidence emerged: a phone call she made while inside the vehicle of the unknown man. At the time, Amber was speaking with her brother, who was incarcerated, meaning their call was automatically recorded. This decision to call her brother would later provide the most important lead in her case. The recording captured nearly 17 minutes of conversation between Amber and the unidentified man, but only about 1 minute has ever been publicly released. In that audio, Amber can be heard questioning the man about where he is taking her. He repeatedly insists that they are heading north toward Edmonton, but Amber's growing confusion and fear are clear. She challenges his directions, at one point exclaiming that he had better not be taking her somewhere she does not want to go. Police believe the man was lying to her, and that, instead of driving toward the city, he was heading south into rural parts of Leduc County. Amber's rising alarm is unmistakable in the recording. with her final audible question, "Where are we?" leaving a haunting echo of her last moments. For years, investigators have considered this audio to be the strongest clue in identifying Amber's killer. The voice of the man is distinct, and authorities have appealed to the public repeatedly, hoping that someone close to him would recognize it. Despite widespread media coverage and countless plays of the audio, the speaker has never been definitively identified, leaving a chilling mystery at the heart of the case. When Amber Tuccaro's family reported her missing on August 19th of 2010, they immediately sensed that her case was not taken seriously. Officers with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in Leduc suggested she had probably gone out on her own and would soon return. This dismissive attitude delayed any meaningful search efforts during the most crucial early hours. Within just 10 days of her disappearance, an officer recommended that Amber be removed from the National Missing Persons database. That decision was based on unconfirmed information and created a devastating setback. For nearly a month, Amber was not even officially listed as a missing person. In those lost weeks, investigators failed to conduct interviews with potential witnesses or secure key evidence. Even Amber's personal belongings, left behind in the Nisku motel room, were mishandled. Instead of being preserved as evidence, they sat untouched for months before ultimately being destroyed. This meant that potential LUTs, such as fingerprints or DNA, were lost forever. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police did not begin interviewing those who might have had information until 4 months after Amber vanished. To the Tuccaro family, this delay showed a shocking lack of urgency. By the time the interviews began, memories had faded and possible witnesses were harder to locate. In the years that followed, complaints about the handling of Amber's case grew louder. Her family formally filed a grievance in 2014, leading to an independent review. That review, completed in 2018, described the investigation as deficient and inadequate. In 2019, a deputy commissioner of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police publicly apologized, admitting the investigation was not our best work. For Amber's family, the apology did little to ease their pain. To them, the failures represented more than mistakes. They symbolized a lack of respect and urgency for the life of an Indigenous woman. After 2 long years of waiting and searching, Amber Tuccaro's family finally received some answers. In August of 2012, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police released a brief 1-minute clip of the phone call Amber had made while in the vehicle with the unknown man. The recording became a critical piece of evidence, providing the only audio of Amber in her final moments. Just a few days later, on September 1st of 2012, a group of horseback riders discovered a human skull in a rural field in Leduc County. Dental records later confirmed it was Amber Tuccaro. The location of her remains was not far from the back roads, where her phone call suggested she had been taken, bringing a heartbreaking clarity to the timeline of her disappearance. The discovery of her remains marked the beginning of a renewed investigation. Police continue to treat the case as an active homicide, seeking anyone who may have information about the man who drove her away. The recording of her voice remains the most important clue, yet the man's identity has never been confirmed. Investigators hope that someone, whether a family member, friend, or witness, may recognize the voice and come forward. Amber's case has become a significant example of the national crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada. Her story highlights systemic failures in law enforcement and the urgent need for accountability. The Tuccaro family has remained a powerful voice, advocating for justice and reforms to protect Indigenous women. Her brother, Chief Billy Joe Tuccaro, has stated publicly that the family wants all missing Indigenous women to be treated with the same urgency as any other citizen. The search for Amber's killer continues, but her story has already sparked awareness across Canada. Tips continue to come in from the public, and the case remains open, with investigators actively following leads. Amber Tuccaro's legacy is one of resilience and determination, She was a beloved mother, daughter, and sister whose life and tragic death have brought attention to a wider social issue. Her family's tireless advocacy ensures that her name and the call for justice will never be forgotten. The hope remains that one day, someone with the truth about what happened to Amber will step forward and finally bring closure to her family. Gilbert Colin Thatcher was born in the year 1938 in Saskatchewan, a province where politics and farming shaped much of daily life. He was the son of Ross Thatcher, a man who would go on to serve as premier of the province from 1964 until his death in 1971. Growing up in this household, Colin Thatcher was surrounded by influence and privilege. He learned early on how much power and reputation mattered in public life, and he appeared destined to follow in his father's footsteps. Colin Thatcher was educated both in Canada and in the United States. He attended schools in Saskatchewan before studying at the University of Saskatchewan and later at the University of Wisconsin. These years gave him experience outside of his home province, but they also tied him closely to the image of a young man being groomed for leadership. In addition to politics, Thatcher developed a strong interest in ranching, and by the late 1960s, he managed large stretches of land near Moose Jaw. His success in agriculture boosted his standing, showing he was not only the son of a premier, but also a businessman in his own right. In the year 1962, Thatcher married Joanne Geiger. The two of them seemed to represent stability and prosperity, raising their 3 children in a world that blended wealth, politics, and rural traditions. For much of the 1960s, they lived the kind of life admired in Saskatchewan's close-knit communities. Publicly, Colin Thatcher worked to shape his image as a devoted family man and serious rancher. Privately, his drive for control and influence was already a central part of his personality. By the early 1970s, Colin Thatcher stepped formally into politics. In 1975, he was elected as a member of the Legislative Assembly for the Progressive Conservative Party. He quickly gained attention for being outspoken, ambitious, and confident, earning a reputation as a politician who was not afraid of confrontation. In 1982, when Grant Devine became premier, Thatcher was appointed as Minister of Energy and Mines. This placed him at the heart of one of the most important portfolios in Saskatchewan, where debates about resources and energy shaped much of the province's economy. During this time, Thatcher was seen by some as a rising star, and a man who had the name, the connections, and the experience to one day reach the top of Saskatchewan politics. But the pressure of public office, combined with the strain in his personal life, would soon set the stage for conflict. The same determination and defiance that served him in politics began to appear in his marriage and family relationships. Beneath the polished image of a powerful politician, tensions were building that would eventually spill out into one of the most infamous criminal cases in Canadian history. By the late 1970s, the marriage between Colin Thatcher and his wife Joanne had begun to unravel. What had once seemed like a picture of stability was breaking apart under constant arguments and growing mistrust. Thatcher's political career was advancing, but life at home was marked by distance and hostility. Joanne, who had once been supportive of her husband's ambitions, grew increasingly unhappy in the marriage. Their differences, once private, soon spilled into the open and became part of a bitter separation. In 1981, Joanne and Colin Thatcher formally divorced, ending nearly 2 decades of marriage. But the separation did not bring peace. Instead, it marked the beginning of a long and heated battle over money, property, and custody of their 3 children. Thatcher insisted on control, while Joanne pushed back, determined to secure independence for herself and her children. The legal fights between them became increasingly drawn out and filled with anger. The divorce coincided with Thatcher's growing influence in provincial politics, making the conflict a public matter as well as a private one. Joanne often felt intimidated and pressured, telling friends and family that she believed her former husband was determined to make her life as difficult as possible. The stress of their dispute began to affect Joanne's health and emotional well-being. Despite this, she refused to back down, continuing to pursue her rights in court. In the early 1980s, Joanne moved into a home in Regina, where she focused on raising her children and rebuilding her life. She tried to create stability in the face of constant legal and personal battles. Friends later recalled her as resilient, though deeply worn down by the ongoing struggles with her ex-husband, while Colin Thatcher projected the image of a successful rancher and politician. His feud with Joanne became an increasingly consuming part of his private life. As the years passed, the hostility between them only deepened. Disputes over financial support, property, and access to their children kept the two locked in conflict. Joanne often expressed fear and exhaustion, feeling as though she could never escape her ex-husband's reach. The bitterness of their divorce went beyond what many expected, raising concerns among those closest to Joanne that the situation could spiral further. This growing sense of unease would soon take a tragic turn, leaving Saskatchewan stunned. On the night of January 21st, 1983, Joanne Wilson was found dead in her Regina home. The scene left investigators immediately suspecting foul play. The violent nature of the crime stunned the community, not only because of its brutality, but also because Joanne was known as a kind and devoted mother who had been fighting to create stability after her divorce. Her death quickly became one of the most high-profile cases in Saskatchewan. Police launched an extensive investigation, combing through Joanne's personal life, her ongoing legal disputes, and her strained relationship with her ex-husband, Colin Thatcher. Almost immediately, questions arose about whether the hostility between the two had crossed into something darker. While Thatcher was a well-known political figure and had cultivated an image of authority and influence, the bitter divorce and lengthy custody battles placed him in the spotlight as a possible suspect. Detectives examined Joanne's home for evidence, collected witness statements, and followed leads that suggested her death may not have been a random act. Friends of Joanne told investigators that she had been fearful in the months leading up to her murder. Her concerns about safety became critical pieces in building a timeline of events that helped police narrow their focus. In the weeks following the crime, public interest only grew stronger. Newspapers across Saskatchewan carried daily updates, and radio stations discussed the shocking case, often connecting it back to Thatcher's political prominence. The murder was not just a personal tragedy, but now a public scandal that mixed politics, crime, and deep community concern. By mid-1983, investigators were convinced that Joanne's murder was a targeted attack rather than a random incident. They worked to gather enough evidence to support their suspicions, slowly building a case that pointed towards someone connected to Thatcher. Behind closed doors, whispers spread about the possibility of a murder-for-hire plot, something that would have seemed unimaginable only a few years earlier. The investigation set the stage for one of Saskatchewan's most sensational trials, where private family struggles would collide with public politics, and the question of Colin Thatcher's guilt would dominate headlines across the country. By May of 1984, after months of investigation, police formally charged Colin Thatcher with first-degree murder in connection with the death of his ex-wife, Joanne Wilson. His arrest shocked Saskatchewan, not only because of the crime itself, but because Thatcher had been a highly visible politician, once serving as Minister of Energy and Resources. The charges ensured that the case would become one of the most closely watched trials in Canadian history. The trial began in Saskatoon in the autumn of 1984. Courtrooms were filled daily with reporters, members of the public, and legal experts who wanted to witness the downfall of a man who had once belonged to one of the province's most prominent families. The prosecution presented a detailed case built on both circumstantial evidence and witness testimony, including accounts from individuals who claimed Thatcher had spoken openly about harming his ex-wife. Though the murder weapon was never recovered, prosecutors tied Thatcher to firearms purchases, suspicious activity near Joanne's home, and testimony that painted him as controlling and vengeful. Thatcher's defense team tried to dismantle the Crown's evidence, arguing that the case against him was built on speculation. In a dramatic move, Thatcher himself chose to testify. While he remained calm at times, moments of anger and arrogance on the stand weakened his credibility with the jury. The prosecution emphasized that Joanne's murder was not random, but instead the culmination of years of hostility, legal battles, and threats. On November the 6th, 1984, the jury delivered its verdict. Colin Thatcher was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years. The conviction marked a stunning fall from grace for a man born into political privilege, and it permanently linked his name to one of Canada's most infamous domestic homicide cases. Thatcher launched several appeals in the years that followed, all of which were rejected by higher courts. While serving his sentence, he wrote a book in which he claimed he had been wrongfully convicted. In response, Saskatchewan passed legislation to prevent convicted criminals from profiting off their crimes, directing royalties from his book toward victims' groups. After serving 22 years, Thatcher was granted full parole in November of 2006. He returned to private life, eventually remarrying and continuing to maintain his innocence. However, his legacy remained tarnished. In 2022, his attendance at a legislative ceremony caused public outrage, reigniting debate about whether he should ever have been welcomed back into the political arena. Today, the name Colin Thatcher is remembered less for his time as a cabinet minister and more for the crime that shocked a province. His conviction underscored how even those with power and influence are not immune to justice. For many Canadians, the case remains a chilling reminder of betrayal, abuse of privilege, and how a political dynasty collapsed under the weight of murder. Robert William Pickton was born on October 24, 1949, in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia. He grew up on a pig farm just outside Vancouver, a place far from the city's busy streets. But life on the farm was far from peaceful. The Pickton family farm was described by neighbors as dirty and poorly kept, with animals wandering freely inside the house. Robert and his younger brother, David, had a difficult childhood. They were often bullied at school because of their messy appearance and the strong farm smell that followed them everywhere. Robert struggled in school and was placed in special education classes after failing second grade. He had a close, if complicated, relationship with his mother, but reportedly a troubled and distant connection with his father. One story that sticks out is from when Robert was about 12 years old. He raised a calf that he loved, but one day he came home to find it had been killed. This experience, combined with the neglectful environment, seemed to harden him and may have influenced how he viewed other living beings. After leaving school, Robert worked as a meat cutter apprentice for nearly 7 years. When his parents died in the late 1970s, he and his siblings inherited the family farm. Instead of leaving, Robert and his brother stayed and began hosting wild parties at the farm, which they called the Piggy Palace. These gatherings included various people from the local community, and the farm became known for its chaotic and lawless atmosphere. However, behind the scenes, Robert Pickton was hiding a dark and terrible secret that would later shock all of Canada. During the 1990s, the downtown east side of Vancouver became the center of growing concern. This neighborhood faced severe poverty, addiction, and homelessness. Many women living and working there were vulnerable, and they began to vanish without explanation. These women were often Indigenous and marginalized, making them especially at risk and frequently overlooked by society and law enforcement. Between the mid-1990s and early 2000s, numerous women disappeared from this area. Families reported them missing, but their cases did not receive the attention they deserved. Police often viewed these women through a lens of suspicion due to their involvement in drug use or work on the street, leading to delayed or minimal investigation. This lack of urgency allowed the disappearances to continue without immediate action. Meanwhile, Robert Pickton was exploiting this vulnerability. He used promises of money, drugs, and shelter to lure women to his farm in Port Coquitlam. What happened once they arrived was horrific. Over time, evidence would show that many women never left his property alive, turning the farm into a place of unimaginable tragedy. The growing number of missing women was a silent alarm that something terrible was happening, but the full story was still hidden from the public eye. Despite the growing number of missing women, police efforts to stop Robert Pickton were plagued by serious problems. One of the earliest missed chances came in March of 1997. A woman escaped from Pickton's farm, badly injured and terrified, and told police he had attacked her. He was arrested and charged with attempted murder and other offenses. But surprisingly, the charges were dropped in 1998 because prosecutors believed the victim's addiction issues made her unreliable. This decision had tragic consequences. After the charges were dropped, many more women went missing. Police had evidence from that earlier case, including Pickton's clothing, with DNA from missing women, but it was not properly tested for years. Additionally, tips from informants about Pickton's suspicious activities were ignored or mishandled. A major problem was poor communication between two police forces, the Vancouver Police Department and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. The farm was in the RCMP's area, but the missing women reports came to the Vancouver police. This lack of coordination delayed the investigation. Later, a public inquiry called Forsaken exposed the systemic failures and biases that allowed Pickton to continue. It revealed that many officers and officials dismissed the missing women's cases because of their background and lifestyle. This failure to take the disappearances seriously created a dangerous environment that allowed a serial killer to operate freely for years. The breakthrough in the Robert Pickton case came in early 2002, but it was not related to the missing women investigation. A former employee reported seeing illegal firearms in Pickton's trailer, which gave the Royal Canadian Mounted Police enough reason to obtain a search warrant for the farm. On February 5th, 2002, a joint task force from the Vancouver Police Department and the RCMP began searching the Port Coquitlam property. What they uncovered was horrifying. The farm was cluttered with old buildings, junk, and signs of long-term neglect. As they searched, police found personal belongings belonging to many missing women, including jewelry and clothing. Then human remains were discovered. This led to the largest forensic investigation in Canadian history, costing about $70 million. Specialists used heavy machinery and forensic technology to carefully examine the soil and buildings. In total, DNA from over 30 women was found on the property. Investigators also found severed body parts stored in containers and scattered remains across the farm. These discoveries confirmed the worst fears about Pickton's crimes and marked the beginning of his final legal battle. Robert Pickton was arrested on February 22nd, 2002, and initially charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Over time, these charges grew to 26 counts. During his time in custody, an undercover officer posed as an inmate and recorded Pickton confessing that he had killed 49 women. He even said he regretted not reaching 50 victims, admitting his capture was due to carelessness. The trial began in January 2007, focusing on 6 of the murder charges to ensure a strong case. These 6 victims represented only a portion of the women whose remains were found on the farm. On December 9th, 2007, Pickton was found guilty of 6 counts of second-degree murder, but was acquitted of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years, the harshest sentence allowed under Canadian law at the time. The remaining charges were stayed in 2010, a decision that left some families frustrated, feeling justice was incomplete. However, the case sparked important national conversations about the treatment of missing and murdered Indigenous women and the failures within law enforcement. Robert Pickton remained in prison until his death on May 31st, 2024, at the age of 74, after being assaulted by another inmate. His crimes and the failures that allowed them to continue serve as a powerful reminder of the need to protect society's most vulnerable members. The Pickton case changed Canada forever, shining a light on systemic issues that are still being addressed today. In the rolling field north of Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, life moved slowly and predictably in the summer of 1967. The Peterson family lived on a modest farm just outside the small community of Shell Lake, surrounded by miles of wheat fields and dense patches of forest. James Peterson, a 47-year-old war veteran, and his 42-year-old wife, Evelyn, raised their family with a strong sense of routine and community. Their home was simple but warm, filled with laughter, chores, and the constant hum of daily farm life. The Petersons had 9 children, ranging in age from 1 to 19 years old, with 4-year-old Phyllis being among the youngest. The eldest, 19-year-old Kathy, had recently married and moved to British Columbia, leaving the rest of the children at home. The family was well known and respected in the community, often helping neighbors during harvests and sharing in local gatherings. There were no known disputes, debts, or conflicts. The Petersons were seen as a model family in rural Saskatchewan, living a quiet life of hard work and family bonds. Neighbors described the farm as cheerful and lively. Mornings were marked by early chores, tending to animals, and preparing meals for the children before school. Evenings were spent around the dinner table, and weekends often included visits from friends or nearby relatives. It was the kind of life where everyone knew one another, and doors were left unlocked, trusting in the safety of the small town and its surrounding farmland. Yet, beneath the peaceful surface of Shell Lake, a storm was quietly forming. Far away in the nearby town of Lesk, 21-year-old Victor Ernest Hoffman was battling a rapidly deteriorating mental state. He had been released from a mental hospital only weeks earlier, carrying with him delusions and hallucinations that were growing stronger each day. At that moment, the serene rhythm of farm life in Shell Lake would soon collide with the uncontrollable force of Hoffman's troubled mind, setting the stage for one of Canada's most unimaginable tragedies. Despite the calm, sunny days and familiar routines, the Peterson family's story was about to be marked forever by a single, catastrophic night that would leave a lasting scar on the community and the prairies around Shell Lake. The farm, once a symbol of stability and care, would become the site of a crime that shocked an entire province and remains a chilling example of the consequences of untreated mental illness. In the early hours of August 15th, 1967, the prairie sky over Shell Lake was dark and quiet, the kind of stillness that stretches across miles of wheat fields and dirt roads. Victor Ernest Hoffman, age 21, left his parents' home in Leask, driving along the empty country roads. He was carrying a .22 caliber Browning pump-action rifle, and his mind was consumed by the voices and hallucinations that had been tormenting him for years. Hoffman had been discharged from the Saskatchewan hospital only 3 weeks earlier, and the mental health treatment he received had not resolved his delusions. The farmhouse of the Peterson family came into view under the dim glow of the pre-dawn light. Hoffman had never visited the farm before and had no personal connection to the family. According to statements he later made to police, he believed he was following instructions from voices in his head, directing him toward the house. The tranquility of the rural neighborhood contrasted sharply with the dark intentions driving him that night. He entered the small white farmhouse, moving methodically through the 4-room home. The children were asleep, and the parents were still awake in the main living area. The household was completely unaware of the danger approaching, and no alarm was raised. In a matter of minutes, Hoffman carried out his plan, resulting in the deaths of 9 members of the Peterson family. Amid this devastating act, 1 life was spared. 4-year-old Phyllis Peterson survived the night, hidden under bedclothes and shielded by the presence of her siblings. She later recalled being frightened by the unfamiliar voices and by the arrival of many police officers, but physically, she was unharmed. Her survival would later be a crucial part of the story, providing investigators with insight into the sequence of events and preserving a connection to the family for the community to remember. The night ended with a silence that seemed heavier than the still prairie air. The calm that had characterized life on the farm was broken forever, and Shell Lake would never feel the same. The tragedy marked the beginning of a complex investigation and a wider discussion in Canada about mental health, responsibility, and community safety in the face of unforeseen violence. Later that morning, on August 15th, 1967, a neighbor named Wildrew Lang approached the Peterson farmhouse. He had planned to help with the day's chores, but the house was eerily quiet. Upon entering, he realized something was seriously wrong. The scene inside shocked him, and he immediately drove 4 miles to the nearest telephone to alert authorities. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police quickly arrived and secured the area, beginning a careful examination of the house. They confirmed the deaths of 9 family members, but also discovered a small miracle. 4-year-old Phyllis Peterson was found unharmed, tucked beneath bedclothes, and protected by her siblings. Officers who carried her from the home noted the quiet resilience of the young girl amidst the tragedy surrounding her. The discovery of the crime set off one of the largest manhunts in Saskatchewan's history. Officers established roadblocks on rural highways and coordinated search parties to cover miles of farmland, forests, and small roads. Information came in from locals in other provinces as authorities worked tirelessly to identify and locate the perpetrator. Tips eventually pointed to a young man in Lesk who had recently been released from a mental hospital. Authorities focused on Victor Hoffman, and within 4 days, on August 19th, 1967, he was located and arrested at his parents' home. He surrendered without resistance, ending the manhunt, but opening a new chapter in understanding the motives and mental state behind the unimaginable crime. Victor Ernest Hoffman, born in 1946, had a long history of mental health struggles that had largely gone unnoticed. From a young age, he experienced hallucinations and disturbing thoughts, which became more intense as he grew older. By his teenage years, Hoffman had developed paranoid delusions that worried his family, but were not fully understood by the medical professionals overseeing his care. In July 1967, just weeks before the murders, Hoffman had been admitted to the Saskatchewan hospital for treatment. He received medication and other therapies. Yet the severity of his condition was underestimated. He was released under the care of his parents, who tried to manage his increasingly erratic behavior at home. Despite warning signs, no one anticipated that Hoffman would commit one of the most shocking crimes in Canadian history. Upon his arrest, police and psychiatrists quickly realized the depth of his mental illness. Hoffman described hearing voices and seeing visions that commanded his actions. His diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia was confirmed, and it became clear that he was not only severely unwell, but also disconnected from reality in ways that made him extremely dangerous. Hoffman's statements after his arrest were often contradictory. He spoke of being influenced by dark forces, but also showed moments of lucidity when recalling the events leading up to the murders. These details helped authorities understand his mindset and provided crucial context for the trial that would follow. The case highlighted the serious gaps in mental health care and the challenges of identifying individuals at risk of committing severe acts of violence before tragedy strikes. The aftermath of the Shell Lake murders left an enduring mark on the community and the province of Saskatchewan. In February 1968, Victor Hoffman was found not guilty by reason of insanity and committed to a secure psychiatric institution where he would spend the remainder of his life. This verdict sparked national discussion about mental health care, the responsibility of institutions, and the challenges of preventing such tragedies. For the surviving family members, life was forever changed. 4-year-old Phyllis Peterson was raised under the care of her older sister Kathy and her husband, who returned from British Columbia to support the family. Phyllis grew up carrying the weight of the trauma, often struggling with nightmares and the attention brought by being the sole survivor. The community of Shell Lake rallied around the Petersons, offering support while also processing their own grief over the devastating event. The case also influenced mental health policy in Canada, highlighting the risks of discharging patients without adequate follow-up or support. Hoffman's story became a cautionary tale about the importance of early intervention and careful monitoring of individuals with severe psychiatric disorders. Today, the Shell Lake murders remain one of Canada's most infamous cases of random mass violence. The Peterson family is remembered for their close bonds and resilience, and the events of August 15th, 1967, serve as a haunting reminder of how fragile safety can be in even the most peaceful communities. The story continues to resonate, emphasizing the critical need for awareness, compassion, and vigilance in both mental health care and community support systems. Rebecca Lynn Boutillier was born in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, in the early 1970s. Her childhood began with a tragedy that would shape the rest of her life. When she was only 18 months old, her father died in a car accident, leaving her mother to raise her on her own. Looking for a fresh start, Rebecca's mother eventually moved west, settling in Calgary, Alberta, with hopes of building a better future for her and her young daughter. Those who knew Rebecca remembered her as a girl who was very close to her mother. They spoke often, and the bond between them was strong, forged in grief and the need to support one another. As she grew older, however, Rebecca began to keep parts of her life private, something her mother would later describe as a secret life. It was not unusual for young people in a new city to struggle with identity and direction, but for Rebecca, these struggles often carried higher risks. Despite the difficulties she faced, Rebecca experienced joy with the birth of her son in December of 1991. Becoming a mother at only 20 years old brought new responsibilities and dreams for the future. She wanted to provide stability and opportunities for her little boy, even while facing financial challenges. Those close to her described her as a young woman trying to balance hope for a better future with the harsh realities of her circumstances. By 1993, Rebecca was navigating the streets of Calgary during a time when the city was grappling with issues of crime and economic change. Many young women in similar positions found themselves in dangerous environments, trying to earn enough to survive. For Rebecca, these circumstances placed her at risk in ways that neither she nor her family could have imagined. Her story begins as one of resilience, a young mother determined to raise her son while confronting the shadows of past loss and present hardship. But the choices she made to provide for her child and the dangers of the world around her would ultimately lead her into the path of something far more sinister. On February 12th, 1993, 20-year-old Rebecca was seen for the final time in downtown Calgary. Witnesses place her near the intersection of 3rd Avenue and 4th Street Southwest, wearing a distinctive black suede jacket with a brass buckle at the waist. One woman working the same area later told police she believed Rebecca got into a blue sedan that evening. That vehicle became central to the investigation. If the model or driver could be traced, it might reveal a key lead. Her disappearance came without warning. No report of a fight. No known plans that evening. No messages explaining where she would go. For hours after she vanished, family and friends had no idea what had happened. She did not return home, she made no calls, and she left no clear trail. The missing purse, boots, and jacket added to the mystery. Items she was known to be wearing that night never surfaced. By the next morning, concern had turned to fear. The Calgary Police Service began a formal missing person inquiry, treating the case not as a simple absence, but as something far more sinister. This decision would prove critical for how indicators of violence and foul play were handled in the coming investigation. After nearly a month without answers, the search for Rebecca took its darkest turn. On March 11th, 1993, Her remains were discovered in a field just east of McKnight Boulevard and 68th Street, northeast in Calgary. The location was beside a pile of discarded roofing shingles. That detail struck investigators as ominous and deliberate, because the area was near a busy roadway rather than deep wilderness. It suggested a killer with boldness and confidence. The autopsy confirmed that Rebecca had died by stabbing, a violent act that left no question about the cause of death. Some items that should have been with her that night were never found. Her black suede jacket, the boots she wore, and her purse remained missing. Investigators believe the missing items may have been taken by the perpetrator as trophies or souvenirs. Nearby Rebecca's body, officers found a pile of clothing that did not belong to her. That clothing was later traced to a woman working the streets who reported being attacked during a bad date in a vehicle. The woman, understandably fearful, refused to fully cooperate, leaving investigators with a tantalizing lead but little to follow. The combination of clues, the missing jacket and boots, the foreign clothing, the exposed location, painted a chilling portrait of someone who planned the crime and wanted parts of it to be seen. Yet those parts also obscured identity. The evidence was unsettling and partial, leaving investigators facing a murder scene with many questions but few certainties. In the months after Rebecca's body was discovered, Calgary police faced a deeply troubling case. Detectives believed she had been the victim of a predatory killer who may have been targeting women in the city. The missing personal items, the stabbing, and the bold disposal site all suggested someone experienced in violence. Investigators began to consider whether Rebecca's murder might be linked to other unsolved cases in Alberta during the 1990s. One significant lead came from the clothing found near her body. It had belonged to another woman who reported being attacked during a dangerous encounter in a vehicle. While she initially shared some details, fear of retaliation kept her from fully cooperating. This left police with only fragments of information that hinted at a repeat offender. Detectives noted that the similarities between the two cases could not be ignored. Attention eventually turned to a man named Luc Gregoire. He was a violent offender with a history of targeting women and was active in Calgary during the time of Rebecca's disappearance. Gregoire was later linked to several other violent crimes, and police quietly explored whether he could have been responsible for Rebecca's death. Though suspicions surrounded him, no definitive evidence tied him directly to the case. Investigators also examined the possibility of a serial predator operating in Calgary in the early 1990s. At least 3 women working in vulnerable circumstances were killed in the city around that period. Some were stabbed, while others were left in exposed locations similar to where Rebecca was found. Detectives could not ignore the pattern, but proving a direct connection remained elusive. Despite the challenges, officers continued pursuing tips, interviewing witnesses, and searching for Rebecca's missing belongings. Each piece of information was logged carefully, but the lack of physical evidence, like DNA or eyewitness accounts, made progress painfully slow. For Rebecca's family, the investigation offered hope, yet also deep frustration. Decades after Rebecca Lynn Boutillier's disappearance and murder, the case remains officially unsolved. Despite extensive police work, no one has ever been charged in connection with her death. Investigators have long suspected that she may have fallen victim to a serial predator, but without conclusive forensic evidence, the truth has stayed out of reach. For her family, the lack of justice has left a lasting wound that has never fully healed. Rebecca's case stands as one of Calgary's most haunting cold cases from the early 1990s. Her murder has been featured in Canadian media and remains a painful reminder of how vulnerable women, especially those living on the margins of society, can be. Advocacy groups have since called for more resources to address cases of missing and murdered women, urging that no victim's story should ever be forgotten. Over the years, police have periodically revisited the case as technology and forensic science advanced. DNA testing and criminal databases have solved other cold cases from that same era, offering hope that one day Rebecca's killer may be identified. However, so far, no breakthrough has come. Each passing year has deepened the uncertainty surrounding her story. For the public, Rebecca's disappearance and tragic death continue to stir questions about who is responsible and whether justice will ever be served. Some believe that her case was connected to other violent crimes in Alberta, while others think her killer may have died before being caught. Either way, the answers lie hidden in the shadows of Calgary's history. To this day, Rebecca Lynn Boutillier is remembered not just as a victim, but as a young woman whose life was taken too soon. Her story serves as a somber reminder of the countless unresolved cases that still weigh heavily on families across Canada. Until the truth is uncovered, her disappearance will remain one of Alberta's most chilling mysteries.